Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The brass nameplate on my desk still felt foreign beneath my fingertips when the call came through at 2:47 a.m. 3 weeks into my tenure as night manager at the Ocean View Grand, and I was already questioning every decision that had led me to this weathered monument of hospitality perched on the Atlantic's edge. The hotel had stood for nearly a century, its Art Deco facade now salt-stained and weary, like an aging starlet refusing to leave the spotlight. Mrs. Chen's voice crackled through the ancient intercom system, urgent but controlled. The main elevator had died without warning, trapping 2 guests on the 3rd floor who needed to reach their suite on the 7th. The backup generator hummed its mechanical lullaby in the basement, ensuring the lights stayed on, but the primary lift remained stubbornly motionless behind its brass doors. I straightened my tie and grabbed the master keys, their weight familiar now, after countless midnight emergencies. The Ocean View Grand attracted a particular type of guest, those who appreciated history over convenience, character over comfort. Tonight's stranded visitors were no exception. An elderly couple from Boston who'd specifically requested the honeymoon suite where they'd stayed 50 years ago. The service elevator lurked behind an unmarked door near the kitchen, a utilitarian afterthought installed during renovations in the 1970s. Unlike its elegant counterpart in the main lobby, this one bore no ornamentation, just scarred steel and function over form. I'd used it dozens of times during my brief tenure, hauling linens and supplies between floors with mechanical efficiency. Mr. and Mrs. Patterson waited by the broken elevator, their patience wearing thin despite their polite smiles. He leaned heavily on a walking cane, his breath coming in short puffs, while she clutched a vintage carpet bag that looked older than the hotel itself. I assured them the service elevator would have them to their room within minutes, though something in the old man's eyes suggested he'd heard similar promises before. The service elevator's call button felt unusually cold beneath my finger, and I noticed my breath misting slightly in the suddenly chilled air. The ocean wind must have found its way through the hotel's aging bones, I reasoned, though the sensation lingered longer than comfort allowed. When the doors finally parted with their familiar grinding protest, the interior looked exactly as it always had. Stark fluorescent lighting, worn linoleum flooring, and a panel of buttons numbered 1 through 8. Mrs. Patterson entered first, her husband following with careful steps. I pressed the button for the 7th floor and felt the elevator lurch into motion with its characteristic mechanical wheeze. The numbers above the door began their slow climb. 1, 2, 3. Then something changed. The fluorescent lights flickered once, twice, then settled into an unstable rhythm that cast dancing shadows across our faces. The digital display above the buttons, which normally showed our floor with steady red numerals, began cycling through numbers that made no sense. 7 became -7, then -12, then symbols I'd never seen before, geometric shapes that hurt to look at directly. Mr. Patterson mentioned the strange display with mild curiosity, though his wife seemed not to notice, her attention fixed on the brass buttons of her coat. I forced a laugh and blamed the hotel's aging electrical system, but my palms had begun to sweat despite the growing cold. The elevator continued its ascent, though the sensation felt wrong somehow. Not the familiar upward pull I'd experienced countless times before, but something sideways, diagonal, as if we were moving through space in directions that shouldn't exist. The fluorescent tubes above us buzzed with increasing intensity, and I caught the first hint of something else. A smell like low tide and copper pennies. When the doors finally opened, we weren't on the 7th floor. The corridor beyond stretched into shadows that seemed to swallow our elevator's meager light. Aged tiles covered the walls, their once white surface now stained with moisture that dripped steadily from somewhere above. The carpet beneath our feet squelched with each step, saturated with brine that left dark footprints in our wake. The smell that had begun as a subtle suggestion now overwhelmed everything else. Ancient seaweed, rusted metal, and something deeper and more organic that made my stomach clench. Mrs. Patterson asked about the decor with polite bewilderment, noting how different it looked from the rest of the hotel. Her husband said nothing, but his grip on his cane had tightened until his knuckles showed white beneath the dim lighting. I explained that this must be a service corridor, perhaps used for maintenance access, though I'd never seen it before in all my late-night wanderings through the hotel's hidden spaces. The elevator doors slid shut behind us with unusual finality, leaving us stranded in this impossible space. The call button beside the doors bore no resemblance to any I'd seen before. Instead of the familiar up and down arrows, strange symbols were etched into the brass, symbols that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. We had no choice but to explore. The corridor stretched in both directions, lined with doors that bore no numbers, no names, only more of those shifting symbols that made my eyes water. The sound of our footsteps echoed strangely, as if the walls were hollow or infinitely deep. With each step, the organic smell grew stronger, mixed now with something that reminded me of burning electricity. Then the doors began to move. The first one opened with a soft click as we passed, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. Then another, and another, until the entire corridor became a symphony of opening and closing doors, each one revealing the same impenetrable black void. The sound was rhythmic, hypnotic, like breathing or waves against a distant shore. Mrs. Patterson clutched her husband's arm and mentioned how drafty the corridor had become. Indeed, wind seemed to blow from everywhere and nowhere, carrying with it more of that ancient ocean smell and something else. Whispers that might have been voices or might have been the building settling around us. I assured them we'd find the main staircase soon, though my confidence was rapidly eroding. The hotel's blueprints, which I'd studied obsessively during my first week, showed no sub-basement, no negative floors, certainly nothing like this maze of weeping tiles and impossible geometry. Yet here we stood, 3 floors below ground level according to the elevator's display, in a space that couldn't exist. The corridor began to curve, subtly at first, then more dramatically, until we were walking in what felt like a slow spiral. The doors continued their rhythmic opening and closing, and I began to notice that the darkness beyond them wasn't empty after all. Shapes moved in those spaces, indistinct forms that could have been furniture or shadows or something else entirely. Mr. Patterson's breathing had become labored, and his wife suggested they rest for a moment. We stopped beside one of the perpetually opening doors, and in the brief instant it remained ajar, I saw something that made my blood freeze. The room beyond wasn't empty. It contained what looked like a perfect replica of the honeymoon suite, complete with vintage furniture and ocean view windows, but the view through those windows showed not the familiar Atlantic coastline, but something else entirely. A dark sea beneath a starless sky, where shapes that might have been ships or might have been something else moved with purpose through waters that seemed to flow upward. The door clicked shut before I could process what I'd seen, leaving me to wonder if my eyes had played tricks in the unstable lighting. Mrs. Patterson asked if I was feeling well, noting that I'd gone quite pale. I blamed the poor air circulation and suggested we continue moving. The curved corridor eventually straightened, leading to what appeared to be a service area lined with utility pipes and electrical conduits. The walls here were different, older somehow, made of stones that glistened with moisture and bore marks that could have been carved decorations or could have been something else entirely. The whispers I'd noticed earlier had grown more distinct, though I still couldn't make out individual words. That's when I saw the staircase. It rose from the stone floor like something from a fever dream, its steps carved from the same glistening rock as the walls. Unlike the utilitarian concrete stairs found elsewhere in the hotel, these seemed ancient, worn smooth by countless feet over decades or centuries. Seaweed clung to the banister, fresh and dripping as if the tide had just receded. Mrs. Patterson expressed relief at finding a way up, though her husband seemed hesitant to approach the strange staircase. The whispers had grown louder, more insistent, and I realized they were coming from above, from whatever lay at the top of those impossible steps. As we climbed, the temperature continued to drop, and our breath came in visible puffs that dispersed slowly in the still air. The walls pressed closer with each step, and I noticed that the stone was carved with more of those shifting symbols. now accompanied by figures that looked almost human, but somehow wrong in proportions and posture. The staircase seemed to go on forever, spiraling upward through stone and shadow, past floors that couldn't exist in any rational building plan. Each landing revealed more corridors branching off into darkness, more doors opening and closing in their eternal rhythm, more whispers growing louder and more urgent. Finally, after what felt like hours but could have been minutes, we reached a door marked with familiar numbers. 7. The brass plaque gleamed in the uncertain light, and beyond it lay what appeared to be the hotel's normal 7th-floor corridor, complete with burgundy carpet and warm lighting. I opened the door with trembling hands, and we stepped into the familiar space of the Ocean View Grand's top floor. The Patterson suite lay at the end of the hall, its door bearing the same brass number it had always worn. The elderly couple thanked me profusely for my help, though Mrs. Patterson mentioned how strange the service areas had seemed, and hoped the hotel would address the moisture problem soon. I escorted them to their room, ensured they had everything they needed, and returned to the staircase door through which we'd emerged. But when I turned the handle, it opened onto a simple utility closet filled with cleaning supplies and spare linens. No stone steps, no ancient walls, no whispers in the darkness. The service elevator, when I finally found it again, operated perfectly. The button panel showed only floors 1 through 8, and the digital display functioned normally. I rode it down to the lobby, my hands still shaking, my mind racing to process what we'd experienced. Back at my desk, I pulled out the hotel's original blueprints, documents dating back to the 1920s that showed every floor, every room, every corridor. There was no basement level marked as -1. There never had been. But when I checked the guest registry for the Pattersons' reservation, I found something that made my blood run cold. Their names appeared in the ledger, along with their room number and arrival date. But in the margin, written in faded ink that looked decades old, was a note in handwriting I didn't recognize. Returned from 1, no questions asked. The timestamp on the note was from tonight, written in my own hand, though I had no memory of making it. I sit here now as dawn breaks over the Atlantic, the hotel stirring to life around me as the day shift arrives. In a few hours, I'll turn over my duties to the morning manager and try to forget what happened in those impossible corridors beneath the hotel. But I know I won't succeed, because sometimes late at night when the building settles around me, I hear them again, the whispers from below, calling my name, promising answers to questions I'm afraid to ask. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the service elevator, the buttons show more than 8 floors. Sometimes they show -1. The brass nameplate on my desk has been joined by something else, a key I don't remember receiving, made of the same glistening stone as those impossible stairs. It bears no number, no room designation, only those shifting symbols that hurt to look at directly. I tell myself I'll throw it away, that I'll request a transfer to another hotel, another city, another life where elevators only go where they're supposed to go, and basement levels that don't exist stay properly non-existent. But I know I won't. Because every night, as the clock strikes 2:47 a.m., I find myself reaching for that stone key, wondering what doors it might open, what corridors it might reveal, what truths about the Ocean View Grand wait in the spaces between floors. And sometimes, in the darkest hours before dawn, I think I already know the answer. The hotel has been calling people down to that impossible level for decades, maybe centuries. Guests who ask too many questions, staff who notice too much, travelers who stumble into spaces they were never meant to find. They all receive the same invitation, the same impossible journey through corridors that taste of salt and time. Most return, memory clouded, with only vague recollections of strange service areas and moisture problems. But some don't return at all, leaving only names in old ledgers and rooms that grow colder with each passing year. I check the registry one more time, running my finger down the list of current guests. So many names, so many room numbers, so many arrival dates stretching back further than any hotel should reasonably maintain records. And in the margins, more notes in various hands, all describing the same thing: returns from -1, questions unasked, memories conveniently blurred. The sun rises higher, painting the Atlantic in shades of gold and crimson, and I realize with growing certainty that I'll never leave the Ocean View Grand. Not really, because the hotel has been collecting people like me for generations. Those who see too much, who question too deeply, who stumble into spaces that exist in the margins of reality. We become part of its staff, permanent residents of the impossible floors, guides for future guests who find themselves in elevators that go places they shouldn't. I look at my reflection in the dark computer screen and notice that my nameplate has changed. Where it once read, Night Manager, it now simply says, Concierge, Level 1. Tomorrow night, when the main elevator breaks down again and confused guests need assistance reaching their rooms, I'll be ready. I'll guide them to the service elevator, press the button for their floor, and wait to see where we end up. After all, the Ocean View Grand has always prided itself on customer service, even in the spaces that don't exist. Story 2. The interstate stretched ahead like a black tongue under the storm clouds, and I knew I wasn't going to make it to Phoenix. My eyelids felt like sandpaper, my hands trembling slightly on the steering wheel from too much coffee and too little sleep. The dashboard clock glowed 11:47 p.m. as I spotted the blue highway sign, Texaco, next exit. Thank God. I pulled into the empty lot, gravel crunching under my tires. The gas station squatted in the darkness like a forgotten tomb, its neon signs dead, windows black. A handwritten sign hung crooked on the door, closed for renovations. Perfect. At least the lot was lit by a single buzzing street lamp that cast everything in sickly yellow light. I maneuvered my white cargo van to the far corner, away from the road, and killed the engine. The sudden silence was overwhelming after 12 hours of highway noise. My cargo area was packed tight with sample cases, medical supplies I was hauling to distributors across the Southwest, glucose monitors, blood pressure cuffs, insulin pumps, the kind of gear that kept people alive, ironically, while I felt like I was dying from exhaustion. The vinyl seat creaked as I climbed into the back, shoving aside a box of surgical tubing to clear a space. I'd done this before, sleeping in the van when motels were too expensive or too far. The metal walls felt close in the darkness, but it beat nodding off at 70 miles per hour. I was reaching for my travel pillow when the silence became unbearable. The kind of quiet that makes your ears ring and your thoughts too loud. I fumbled for the radio, spinning the dial through static until I found something, anything, to fill the void. Static. More static. A distant country station fading in and out. Then, clearly, I caught a signal. Whispers. Not conversation. Whispers. Soft, deliberate, barely audible. I turned up the volume, straining to make out words, but they seemed backward, like a recording played in reverse. The hissing consonants and stretched vowels made my skin crawl, but it was better than the oppressive silence. I was settling back against my makeshift pillow when the words became clear. Medical kit. Rectangular. Black plastic latches. Second row from the door. My blood went cold. I sat up, staring at the radio's green display. The whispers continued, still in that eerie reverse cadence, but the words were unmistakable now. Insulin pump, model X47, blue carrying case, corner placement, behind the glucose strips. I whipped around to look at my cargo. There, exactly where the voice described, sat the blue case containing the insulin pump. My hands shook as I reached for the radio dial, but the whispers kept coming. Blood pressure monitor, digital display, black cuff, warranty sticker visible, scratched corner on the left side. I scrambled deeper into the cargo area, pushing boxes aside until I found it. The blood pressure monitor, exactly as described, warranty sticker clearly visible, scratched corner and all. But that was impossible. No one could see inside my van. No one knew what I was carrying. The whispers grew more insistent, describing item after item with surgical precision. The surgical tubing I'd just moved, The box of latex gloves with the torn corner. The glucose test strips arranged in neat rows. Every detail perfect. Every location exact. My throat felt tight. I reached for the radio with trembling fingers, desperate to change the station. But as my hand touched the dial, the whispers stopped. Complete silence. Then, somewhere in the darkness outside, I heard my van's fuel pump kick on. That was impossible. The engine was off. The keys were in my pocket. Fuel pumps don't just start by themselves. But I could hear it clearly. That distinctive electric whir of the pump pressurizing the fuel lines. The sound was coming from underneath the van, exactly where it should be, but it couldn't be running. It physically couldn't be running. I fumbled for the keys, my hands shaking badly now. The engine turned over once, twice, then died with a wet coughing sound. I tried again. Nothing but clicking. The battery was fine. The radio still glowed. The dashboard light still worked. But the engine wouldn't catch. Outside, the fuel pump kept running. I pressed my face to the small rear window, trying to see the gas station. The building sat dark and silent, but now I could see something I'd missed before. The main electrical panel mounted on the side wall, its metal door hanging open. The circuit breakers inside were clearly visible, and I could see one of them glowing red. The fuel pump's circuit breaker. Someone had turned it on manually. Someone was out there, in the dark, controlling my van's electrical system from that panel. But that made no sense. The van ran on its own battery and alternator. The gas station's power had nothing to do with my fuel pump. The pump ran off my van's electrical system, not the building's. Except it was running when it shouldn't be, and that breaker was glowing when it shouldn't be, and those whispers had known things they couldn't possibly know. I had to turn it off. I had to get to that panel and flip that breaker, or the pump would drain my battery and I'd be stranded here until morning. Maybe longer if this place really was closed for renovations. The van's rear doors creaked as I opened them, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. The fuel pump's whir seemed louder now, more aggressive, like it was working harder, drawing more power, killing my battery faster. I dropped down onto the gravel, my work boots crunching on broken glass and scattered debris. The walk to the electrical panel couldn't be more than 50 yards, but it felt like crossing a minefield. Every shadow seemed to shift. Every reflection from the streetlight looked like movement at the edge of my vision. My first step echoed strangely. I froze, listening. The sound had been wrong. Not just the crunch of my boot on gravel, but something else. A second crunch, slightly delayed, like an echo that didn't quite match. I took another step. Crunch. Crunch. Two sounds again, separated by maybe half a second. I stopped and looked around the empty lot. Nothing moved. No wind, no other cars, no animals. Just me and the yellow glow of the streetlight and that incessant whirring from under my van. Maybe it was just the acoustic properties of the lot. Sound bouncing off the building in strange ways. I forced myself to keep walking, but with each step, the echo became more pronounced, more deliberate. Crunch, 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 like someone walking beside me, matching my pace. I spun around, heart hammering. The lot was empty. My van sat where I'd left it, rear doors hanging open, cargo visible in the yellow light. No footprints in the gravel except the disturbed path I'd just made. But as I turned back toward the electrical panel, I could swear I heard breathing that wasn't mine. The panel was only 20 feet away now. I could see the red glow more clearly. Definitely one of the breakers, though I still couldn't understand how it connected to my van. The metal door hung open like a mouth, revealing rows of switches and labels I couldn't read from this distance. Crunch, 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 crunch. The footsteps were definitely there now, keeping perfect time with mine. Not quite synchronized, always just a fraction of a second behind, like someone trying to step in my exact footprints, but not quite managing it. I broke into a jog. The footsteps jogged too. 10 feet from the panel, I could smell something wrong. Not the usual gas station odors of petroleum and motor oil, but something organic, something sweet and cloying, like flowers left too long in water. 5 feet away, I could read the labels on the breakers. Most were handwritten in faded ink. Pumps 1 to 4, office lights, coolers, security. But the one that was glowing had a label I couldn't understand. Symbols that might have been letters in some language I didn't recognize. I reached for the switch. Behind me, the footsteps stopped. In the sudden absence of sound, I became aware of how wrong everything was. The fuel pump under my van had gone silent too, but I could still hear its electrical whir. Except now it seemed to be coming from inside the building, from inside the gas station that was supposed to be closed. My fingers touched the warm metal of the breaker switch, and I looked down. There, pressed into the soft earth beside the concrete pad, were footprints. 2 sets of them. Mine, leading from the van to where I stood, and another set, identical in size and tread pattern, perfectly parallel to mine. The same boots, the same gait, the same spacing between steps. But while my prints showed the normal heel-to-toe pattern of someone walking forward, the second set was different. They showed someone walking backward. Following my path in reverse, step for step, from the electrical panel toward my van, toward my open van where I'd been sleeping, where I'd been listening to whispers that knew things they couldn't know. I flipped the breaker. The red glow died, and in the sudden darkness, I heard something that made my knees weak. The van's rear doors slamming shut. I ran toward the van, my own footsteps now genuinely alone, gravel spraying behind me. The fuel pump had finally gone silent, but I could see something in my peripheral vision, movement at the edge of the streetlight's reach. When I reached the van gasping, the rear doors were indeed closed, but they were locked from the inside. I had the only keys. There was no inside lock on those doors. I fumbled with the key fob, hands shaking so badly I could barely press the button. The locks clicked open with a sound like breaking bones. Inside, my cargo had been rearranged. Not dramatically, not obviously, but the glucose monitor had been moved 3 inches to the left. The insulin pump case was turned 90 degrees. The surgical tubing I'd shoved aside was now neatly coiled. And on top of my travel pillow, written in condensation on the metal wall, were words. You were asleep. We were listening. Now we're awake too. I slammed the doors and ran for the driver's seat. The engine turned over immediately, purring like it had never given me trouble. I threw it into reverse and floored it, spraying gravel as I spun toward the exit. In my mirrors, I watched the gas station shrink behind me. The streetlight flickered once and went out, leaving the lot in perfect darkness. But just before the light died, I saw something that I'm still not sure I believe. The electrical panel was closed now, its metal door latched tight, and standing beside it, perfectly still in the yellow glow, was a figure in work boots, my work boots, watching me drive away with what might have been my own face. I'm writing this 3 days later, in a motel room outside Flagstaff. I made it to Phoenix, delivered my cargo, completed my route. Everything normal. Everything rational. Except I can't explain the radio recordings. While I was driving that night, scared and shaking, I never thought to check if my phone had been recording. It wasn't until I got to the motel that I found the voice memo app running, capturing everything from the moment I'd turned on the radio. 7 hours of audio. Most of it is just road noise and my own breathing. But at the beginning, clear as day, are the whispers. Playing forward now, not backward. Describing my cargo with perfect accuracy. And at the very end, just before I found the message on my van wall, there's something else. My own voice, speaking words I never said. I'm tired of being alone. I'm tired of the road. I'm tired of carrying things for other people. Now I have company. Now someone else can carry the load. I've listened to it 50 times. It's my voice, my inflection, my accent. But I never said those words. I was never awake to say them. The medical supplies I delivered in Phoenix were all accounted for. Nothing missing, nothing damaged. But the inventory sheets show something interesting. Everything had been reorganized during transport. Every single item moved from its original position, then carefully placed back. Just like someone had been going through my cargo while I slept. Someone who knew exactly what was there. Someone who whispered the inventory back to me through a radio that shouldn't have been receiving anything. Someone who left footprints that matched mine exactly. Someone who might still be out there, on that empty stretch of highway, waiting for the next exhausted driver to pull into that lot, waiting to make more company. I keep telling myself it was a hallucination, sleep deprivation, carbon monoxide from a leak in the van's exhaust, anything rational. But I can't explain the recordings, and I can't explain why. When I got home yesterday, my wife asked me why I'd called her at 2 a.m. 3 nights ago. The call, she says, lasted 6 minutes. The call where I apparently told her in my own voice that I'd found a place to rest, that I wouldn't be alone anymore, that someone was going to help me carry my load. I was unconscious in the back of my van when that call was made. My phone was in my pocket, and I don't remember dreaming. End of recording. Case file 4451B, filed under Unexplained Phenomena, Interstate Incidents. Driver cleared for duty after psychological evaluation showed no signs of mental instability. Gas station at mile marker 47, confirmed abandoned since 1987. No electrical service to location for over 30 years. Story 3. The rain hammered against the windows of the Hotel Esperanza, like desperate fingers clawing for entry. I stood in the cramped lobby, my wife Sarah beside me clutching our sleeping baby, while the desk clerk's yellowed teeth gleamed in what he probably thought was a reassuring smile. The power had flickered twice since we'd arrived, casting dancing shadows across the peeling wallpaper that depicted faded tropical birds frozen in perpetual flight. "Storm should pass by morning, senor," the clerk said, sliding a tarnished key across the scarred wooden counter. Room 237, second floor, end of hall. The elevator wheezed and groaned as it carried us upward, its fluorescent light stuttering with each floor. Sarah shifted the baby in her arms, her face drawn with exhaustion. We'd been driving for hours when the storm hit, and this place had been our only option. Every decent hotel in Cancun was either booked solid or charging hurricane prices we couldn't afford. The hallway stretched before us like a tunnel, its brown carpet worn to threads in the center where countless feet had passed. The walls seemed to press inward as we walked, and I noticed how the overhead lights created pools of amber that barely touched each other, leaving gaps of shadow between. Our footsteps echoed strangely, as if the sound was being absorbed and then released moments later from somewhere behind us. Room 237 sat at the very end, isolated from the other rooms by what appeared to be a maintenance area. The key turned with surprising ease, and the door swung open to reveal our temporary sanctuary. The first thing that hit me was the smell. It wasn't the usual musty odor of cheap hotels or the dampness you'd expect during a tropical storm. This was something else entirely. Sharp, antiseptic, with an underlying sweetness that reminded me of those long nights I'd spent in hospital waiting rooms when my father was dying, the scent of industrial disinfectant, trying desperately to mask something organic and persistent. Sarah wrinkled her nose but said nothing. The baby stirred slightly but remained asleep, his tiny chest rising and falling in the rhythm I'd grown to find comforting over these past months. We settled him in the center of the queen bed, building a fortress of pillows around him while Sarah unpacked our meager overnight supplies. The room itself was larger than I'd expected, with a small sitting area near the windows where two threadbare chairs faced each other across a coffee table that had seen better decades. The air conditioning unit rumbled to life with a mechanical wheeze that immediately reminded me of the respiratory equipment from my father's final days. The sound was rhythmic, almost hypnotic, a steady in and out that seemed to sync with my own breathing before I forced myself to consciously alter my pattern. "At least it's cool," Sarah murmured, though I noticed she kept glancing at the unit with the same unease I felt. Outside, the storm raged with increasing fury. Palm fronds slapped against our window like skeletal hands, and the wind howled through what sounded like gaps in the building's structure. But those external sounds seemed muted compared to the strange acoustics inside our room. Every small noise, the drip from the bathroom faucet, the settling of the building, even our whispered conversations, seemed amplified and distorted, as if the walls themselves were listening and reshaping what they heard. I tried to dismiss my growing unease as fatigue and stress. We'd been traveling for 2 days, dealing with delayed flights and missed connections, and now this storm had trapped us in a place that felt more like a way station between worlds than an actual hotel. But as the evening wore on, my rational explanations began to feel increasingly inadequate. The first time I heard it, I convinced myself it was just the air conditioning cycling through its modes, a soft rhythmic sound that seemed to come from within the walls themselves. Not quite mechanical, not quite organic. It reminded me of breathing, but breathing amplified and slowed, as if someone with enormous lungs was taking deep, deliberate breaths just beyond the plaster and paint. Sarah had fallen asleep quickly, exhaustion finally overtaking her anxiety about our surroundings. The baby remained peaceful, his small form rising and falling with each breath. But I found myself lying awake, staring at the ceiling, and listening to that sound that wasn't quite the air conditioning. The breathing, for that's what I'd begun to think of it as, seemed to move. At first, it appeared to originate from the wall behind our headboard, a gentle inhale, exhale that matched my father's old ventilator. But as I lay there in the darkness, it shifted position, traveling along the wall toward the window, then around the corner to the opposite side of the room. The sound never changed in intensity or rhythm, but its location was definitely mobile, as if something large was moving through the spaces between the walls. I rose quietly and moved to the bathroom, hoping the sound of running water might mask whatever I was hearing. But as I stood at the sink, splashing cold water on my face, I realized the breathing had followed me. It was coming from the wall, directly behind the mirror, and in the reflection, I could swear I saw the wallpaper moving slightly, not peeling or shifting, but rising and falling, as if the wall itself was expanding and contracting. When I returned to bed, Sarah was still sleeping peacefully, but the baby had shifted position. He now lay with his face turned toward the wall, and I noticed that his breathing had synchronized with the sound I'd been hearing. His tiny chest rose and fell in perfect unison, with the rhythmic wheezing that seemed to emanate from the building's very bones. I told myself this was natural. Babies were sensitive to their environments, and it made sense that he would adapt to the ambient sounds around him. But watching his small form breathe in time with something I couldn't see or identify filled me with a creeping dread that settled in my chest like ice water. The hours passed with agonizing slowness. Every time I began to drift toward sleep, the breathing would seem to intensify, becoming more pronounced and deliberate. I found myself holding my own breath, trying to break the synchronization that seemed to be pulling us all into some kind of collective respiratory rhythm. But the moment I exhaled, my lungs would automatically fall back into the pattern established by whatever was moving through the walls. Around 3 a.m, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The ceiling directly above our bed had begun to show signs of stress. What had appeared to be normal textured plaster when we'd arrived now displayed a subtle but unmistakable bulge, roughly the size and shape of a human torso. The bulge wasn't static. It rose and fell with the breathing sound, creating the illusion of an enormous chest, expanding and contracting just inches above where we lay. I watched in horrified fascination as the plaster swelled outward with each inhale, then settled back with each exhale. The movement was gradual but definite, and I could see hairline cracks beginning to form around the edges, where the ceiling met the walls. Small particles of dust and paint flakes drifted down like snow, settling on the bed sheets and in Sarah's hair. The rational part of my mind scrambled for explanations. Old building, tropical storm, changes in air pressure, water damage from the roof, all plausible reasons for structural shifting. But the timing was too perfect, too synchronized with the breathing that had been haunting me all night. And there was something about the shape of the bulge that suggested deliberate form rather than random damage. I slipped out of bed again, this time moving to the sitting area where I could observe the ceiling from a different angle. From here, the resemblance to a human ribcage was even more pronounced. I could make out what appeared to be individual ribs pressing against the plaster, and the way the bulge expanded suggested not just breathing, but labored breathing, the kind my father had struggled with during his final weeks. That's when I heard the murmuring. It started as barely audible whispers, seeming to come from the floor near the foot of the bed. The words, if they were words, were indistinct and layered, as if multiple voices were speaking simultaneously in different languages or at different speeds. The sound was intimate and disturbing, like overhearing someone's fever dreams. I crept closer, trying to make out individual sounds or syllables, but the murmuring remained frustratingly unclear. It seemed to respond to my proximity, becoming slightly louder when I moved toward it and fading when I stepped away. But it never stopped completely, maintaining a constant stream of whispered syllables that felt both foreign and familiar. The baby stirred, his small face scrunching in what looked like discomfort. Sarah shifted beside him but remained asleep. I realized that both of them were now breathing in perfect synchronization with the ceiling, their chests rising and falling in time with the bulge overhead. The sight of my family unconsciously mimicking the rhythm of whatever was inhabiting our room filled me with a panic that threatened to overwhelm my remaining rationality. I grabbed my phone, desperate for the comfort of connection with the outside world, but there was no signal. The screen showed full bars when I'd checked earlier, but now it displayed only the emergency message that no service was available. Even the time seemed wrong. The display showed 3:17 a.m., but I was certain hours had passed since I'd last looked. The breathing grew more labored, and the ceiling bulge began to expand beyond what I would have thought possible without complete structural failure. Cracks spiderwebbed outward from the central point, and I could hear the subtle groaning of stressed building materials. But instead of the sharp sounds of breaking plaster, the noises were organic, wet, rhythmic, like the sound of air moving through fluid-filled lungs. I knew I had to act. Whether this was some kind of structural emergency or something far worse, I couldn't let my family remain beneath that deteriorating ceiling. But when I tried to wake Sarah, she felt strangely limp and unresponsive. Her breathing continued in perfect sync with the overhead rhythm, and her skin felt cool to the touch. The baby, too, seemed locked in the same synchronized pattern, his small body rising and falling with mechanical precision. Desperation drove me to try the light switch, hoping that illumination might break whatever spell had settled over the room. But the moment the overhead fixture blazed to life, the breathing sound shifted. Instead of coming from the walls or ceiling, it now seemed to emanate from the light itself. Not the electrical humming of bulbs and ballast, but the actual sound of respiration, as if the fixture had become some kind of mechanical lung. The light revealed that the ceiling bulge was even more pronounced than I'd realized. What I could see in the darkness was only part of the distortion. The entire ceiling had begun to bow downward, creating a cavity that pressed toward the bed like a descending mouth. The cracks weren't random stress fractures, but formed patterns that resembled the branching structure of a respiratory system. But the most disturbing revelation was what the light showed me about Sarah and the baby. Their synchronized breathing wasn't just matching the ambient sound. Their chests were rising and falling with an amplitude that seemed far beyond normal respiration. It was as if they were being forced to breathe for something much larger than themselves, their small lungs working overtime to satisfy an enormous respiratory demand. I turned off the light, plunging us back into darkness, but now I could feel the breathing as well as hear it. The air in the room seemed to move in waves, pressing against my skin with each inhale, pulling away with each exhale. The sensation was claustrophobic and intimate, as if I was trapped inside someone else's lungs, experiencing their respiration from within. The murmuring at the foot of the bed grew more distinct, and I began to make out fragments that sounded like medical terminology, words about oxygen saturation, respiratory distress, and mechanical ventilation. But the voices seemed to be coming from below the floor rather than from any human source, as if the building's foundation was somehow connected to some vast medical facility buried beneath us. I found myself thinking about the hotel's name, Esperanza, which meant hope in Spanish. But what kind of hope was this place offering, and to whom? The ceiling continued its rhythmic expansion and contraction, each cycle bringing the bulge closer to where my family lay unconscious. I could no longer distinguish between their breathing and the ambient sound that filled the room. They had become part of whatever system was operating through the building's structure, their individual respiratory functions subsumed into something larger and more demanding. I backed toward the door, my hand fumbling for the handle, but found myself hesitating. If I left to get help, what would happen to Sarah and the baby? And if this was all in my head, some kind of breakdown triggered by stress and exhaustion, then abandoning them would be an act of cowardice I could never forgive myself for. But as I stood there paralyzed by uncertainty, I felt my own breathing beginning to synchronize with the room's rhythm. My lungs started to fill and empty in time with the ceiling's movement, and I could feel my individual will being absorbed into the collective respiratory pattern that had claimed my family. The sensation was both terrifying and oddly peaceful. There was a relief in surrender, in allowing something else to control the basic function that kept me alive. But beneath that relief was the growing awareness that once I fully synchronized, I might never be able to break free. I forced myself to hold my breath, fighting against the pull of the ambient rhythm. But my lungs burned with the effort, and when I finally had to exhale, the room seemed to exhale with me, as if it had been waiting for my capitulation. The murmuring voices grew clearer, and I began to understand that they weren't speaking about medical procedures. They were speaking to me, offering explanations and reassurances that I desperately wanted to believe. They told me about pressure differentials and atmospheric displacement, about the natural tendency of biological systems to seek equilibrium. They explained that what I was experiencing was simply the building's attempt to regulate itself during the storm, and that my family's breathing patterns were a normal physiological response to changes in air pressure. The explanations sounded reasonable, even comforting, but they came from voices that had no visible source, and they were accompanied by the continued expansion of the ceiling that now hung just feet above the bed where my family lay trapped in their synchronized slumber. I realized that the choice I faced wasn't between reality and delusion, but between resistance and acceptance. The room, or whatever inhabited it, wasn't trying to harm us. It was trying to incorporate us into its own respiratory system, to make us part of something larger than ourselves. The breathing that had haunted me all night wasn't a threat, but an invitation. As dawn approached, the storm outside began to subside, but the breathing within the room continued unchanged. I stood at the crossroads between my individual existence and absorption into something vast and patient and hungry for air. The ceiling pressed closer, the murmuring voices grew more insistent, and my family breathed on in perfect mechanical unison. And I found myself, despite everything, beginning to breathe along with them, my resistance finally crumbling as the room inhaled deeply and drew me into its endless, suffocating embrace. Story 4. The phone's shrill ring cut through my sleep like a blade through fabric. In the darkness of my temporary apartment, the red digital numbers glared 2:47 a.m. I fumbled for the receiver, already knowing this couldn't be good news. Nothing good ever happened at this hour in places like the Meridian Apart Hotel. Mr. Collins? The voice belonged to Elena, the night receptionist. Her usually steady tone carried an edge I hadn't heard before. I'm sorry to wake you, but we need your help. There's been a situation. I sat up, rubbing my eyes. The unfamiliar weight of exhaustion pressed down on me. 3 weeks of restless nights in this place had taken their toll. What kind of situation? Water noises. From 411. She paused, and I could hear her breathing carefully. The apartment directly above yours. Mrs. Chen from 312 called about it an hour ago, and now Mr. Rodriguez from 415 is complaining too. Thing is, another pause. That unit's been empty for months. The building settled around me with its familiar groans and whispers. I'd grown accustomed to the apart hotel's quirks during my extended stay. The elevator that sometimes stopped between floors. The hallway lights that flickered in sequence like falling dominoes. The way certain corridors seemed longer at night than during the day. But this felt different. Have you checked it out? Miguel's up there now, but he can't get in. Doors locked from the inside, and we don't have a master key for that particular unit. The previous manager. She trailed off. Look, I know you're good with this kind of thing. Could you take a look? Miguel's waiting by the elevator. I'd earned a reputation as the building's unofficial problem solver during my stay. Broken locks, stuck windows, mysterious electrical issues. Somehow I'd become the guy people called when the regular maintenance staff couldn't handle something. It beat lying awake, listening to the building's nocturnal symphony. Give me 5 minutes. The hallway outside my apartment stretched in both directions, lit by fluorescent strips that hummed with electrical tension. The carpet, a dated pattern of burgundy and gold, muffled my footsteps as I made my way to the elevator. The air felt thicker up here, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Miguel waited by the elevator doors, shifting his weight from foot to foot. A compact man in his 50s, he'd been the night security guard for almost a decade. I'd never seen him nervous before tonight. "Thank God," he muttered when he saw me. "This whole thing's got me spooked, man. Been doing this job long enough to know when something ain't right." We rode the elevator in silence to the 4th floor. The mechanical wheeze of the cables and the soft ding of each passing floor seemed unnaturally loud. When the doors opened, I immediately heard it. The unmistakable sound of running water, steady and rhythmic, like a shower in full flow. "Been going on for 2 hours now," Miguel said as we walked down the corridor. "Started around 12:30. Mrs. Chen thought maybe pipes burst or something, but..." He gestured helplessly at the door of 411. The apartment door stood closed, unremarkable except for the brass numbers that caught the hallway light. I pressed my ear against the wood. The sound was definitely coming from inside. Not just water running, but the specific acoustics of a shower hitting tile, the echo you get in an enclosed bathroom. "You tried knocking?" Course I tried knocking. No answer. Tried the master key too, but like I told Elena, it don't work on this door. Something about the previous manager changing the locks and never updating the system. Miguel wiped his palms on his uniform pants. "Thing is, I've been checking the empty units all week. This one's been locked tight, and according to the records, nobody's been assigned here since October." I tested the door handle, locked solid. But as my hand touched the metal, I felt something that made me pull back. The handle was cold. Not just cool, but actively cold, as if it had been sitting in a freezer. "Miguel, feel this." He reached out tentatively, then jerked his hand away. "Jesus, that's not normal." The sound of running water continued, steady and purposeful. I knelt and examined the gap under the door. No light seeped through, but something else caught my attention. A faint dampness in the air, the kind you'd expect from a steamy bathroom. Yet when I pressed my face closer to the gap, I felt no moisture, only that strange coldness. "We need to get in there," I said. Miguel shook his head. "Can't just break down a door without authorization. Elena would have my job." "Then call Elena." He used his radio to contact the front desk. Elena's voice crackled through with static. "Do whatever you think is best. If there's flooding up there, it'll damage the apartments below. Mr. Collins, you're our witness if anyone asks questions later." Miguel retrieved a crowbar from his utility cart. The first attempt to force the door accomplished nothing except a loud crack that echoed down the empty hallway. The second try splintered the frame, but the door held firm. It wasn't until the third attempt that something gave way. Not just the lock, but some deeper resistance, as if the apartment itself had been holding the door closed. The door swung open, and the sound of running water stopped. The sudden silence felt more unnerving than the noise had been. Miguel fumbled for the light switch, but nothing happened when he flicked it. "Power's out in here," he muttered, pulling a flashlight from his belt. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing a standard apart hotel layout. Small living area, kitchenette, bedroom door ajar. Everything looked normal, if a bit dusty. The air smelled stale, but not unpleasant, with an underlying hint of something I couldn't identify. Something that reminded me of rain. We moved toward the bathroom, our footsteps muffled by the same burgundy carpet that ran throughout the building. The flashlight beam danced ahead of us, creating shifting shadows that seemed to move independently of our motion. The bathroom door stood open. Miguel's light revealed white tile, a standard shower tub combination, a pedestal sink. Everything appeared normal, even clean. Most importantly, everything was completely dry. "That's impossible," Miguel breathed. We both heard it. Water running for 2 hours straight. I ran my fingers along the shower walls, the faucet handles, the floor of the tub. Not a trace of moisture anywhere. The shower head showed no signs of recent use, no water spots, no residual drips. Even the drain was dry, filled with the dust you'd expect in an unused bathroom. Check the sink, I suggested. Miguel aimed his light at the pedestal sink. The faucet was dry, the bowl dusty, but as his beam moved across the mirror above it, I caught something that made me stop. Point the light back at the mirror. The reflection showed exactly what it should. 2 men in a small bathroom, surrounded by white tile. But for just a moment, I could have sworn I'd seen something else. A flicker of movement, as if someone had been standing behind us. "You see something?" Miguel asked. "Just shadows." But as we stood there, I noticed something else. The bathroom window, a small frosted glass panel above the toilet, was wide open. Night air drifted through, carrying the scent of rain despite the clear evening we'd left behind downstairs. Miguel directed his flashlight toward the window. Been closed all week when I did my rounds. I approached the window carefully. The night outside looked wrong somehow. Too dark, too empty. The parking lot below should have been visible, lit by sodium vapor lamps, but I saw only blackness. And as I leaned closer, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. Water was dripping from the window frame. Not ordinary water. These drops caught Miguel's flashlight beam and reflected it back in a way that seemed almost oily. They were dark, not just shadowed, but actively dark, as if they absorbed light rather than reflecting it. And as each drop fell, it seemed to evaporate before reaching the floor, dissolving into nothing just inches from the tile. "Miguel." My voice came out hoarse. "You seeing this?" But when I turned around, the bathroom was empty. The flashlight lay on the floor where Miguel had been standing, its beam cutting a harsh angle across the white tile. The silence felt absolute now. Not just the absence of sound, but the presence of something that swallowed sound entirely. "Miguel?" I called out, but my voice seemed to stop at the bathroom doorway, as if the apartment beyond had become a vacuum. I grabbed the flashlight and moved quickly through the apartment. Living room empty, kitchen empty, bedroom empty. The front door stood open exactly as we'd left it, but the hallway beyond was dark, not just dim, completely dark, as if the fluorescent lights had all failed simultaneously. I stepped into the corridor and called Miguel's name again. The sound vanished immediately, absorbed by whatever had settled over this floor. The emergency exit signs glowed faintly at either end of the hall, but they seemed impossibly distant, as if the corridor had stretched while I wasn't looking. My apartment was 3 floors below. I needed to get out of here, find Miguel, figure out what was happening. But as I moved toward the elevator, I heard something that stopped me cold. Water running. Again. Not from 411, from somewhere else. Somewhere below. I ran for the stairwell, taking the steps 2 at a time. The sound of running water grew louder as I descended, echoing through the concrete shaft in a way that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. By the time I reached the 3rd floor, I was certain. The sound was coming from my apartment. The hallway lights were working again. That same fluorescent hum I'd left behind 20 minutes ago. Everything looked normal, familiar, safe. But the sound of running water was unmistakable now, and it was definitely coming from behind my door. I used my key with trembling fingers. The lock turned smoothly, and I stepped into my apartment. The familiar layout welcomed me, my laptop still open on the small dining table, my coffee cup from earlier still sitting beside it, everything exactly as I'd left it, except for the sound of running water from the bathroom. I moved through my apartment as carefully as I'd moved through 411, but this time the strangeness was subtle. The air felt different, charged somehow, like the moment before a thunderstorm. The shadows seemed deeper, more substantial, and underlying everything was that same faint scent of rain. The bathroom door stood open, light spilling out. I'd left the light off when I went to bed. I was certain of it. I stepped into the doorway and stopped. Water ran from the faucet in a steady stream, exactly like the shower we'd heard upstairs. But this water was wrong, in the same way the drops from the window had been wrong. It flowed like normal water, made the right sounds, even seemed to splash in the sink. But it didn't behave like water. It didn't wet anything. The stream hit the sink basin and seemed to disappear on contact, leaving no puddle, no moisture, no trace of its presence. When I held my hand under the flow, I felt the sensation of water, cool, moving, substantial, but when I pulled my hand away, it was completely dry. And in the surface of this impossible water, I saw something that made me grip the doorframe for support, a reflection, but not of my bathroom. The image showed another bathroom, similar but different. The tile was a different color, pale blue instead of white. The mirror was a different shape, and standing in that other bathroom, staring back at me through the flowing water, was a figure I almost recognized. It looked like me, but wrong. The face was my face, but the expression was different, vacant, distant, as if whoever was wearing my features was looking at something I couldn't see. The clothes were similar but not identical. My blue t-shirt, but in a slightly different shade. My jeans, but with different stitching. As I watched, transfixed, the other figure raised its hand. I felt my own hand moving, mirroring the motion, but I wasn't controlling it. We pressed our palms against our respective sides of whatever barrier separated us. His against his mirror, mine against the surface of the impossible water. The moment our hands touched our barriers, I felt it. Cold. Not the cold of the door handle upstairs, but something deeper. The cold of vast emptiness, of spaces between spaces, of the distance between what is and what might be. And in that cold, I understood. The apart hotel wasn't just a building with strange quirks and nocturnal sounds. It was a place where the boundaries grew thin, where the spaces between apartments became spaces between possibilities. The empty room above mine wasn't empty. It was occupied by a version of existence that ran parallel to mine, close enough to bleed through in the form of impossible water and reflections that showed truth instead of reality. Miguel hadn't disappeared. He'd simply stepped too far into the space between, become part of the building's collection of almosts and near misses. And now the water was calling to me, showing me the choice. I could step back, turn off the faucet that wouldn't turn off, and pretend this was all exhaustion and stress and the weird acoustics of an old building. I could pack my things in the morning and find somewhere else to finish out my semester. I could return to a world where water was just water, and mirrors showed only what stood in front of them. Or I could lean forward, press my face against the surface of the impossible stream, and see what lay on the other side. The figure in the reflection smiled, my smile, but not quite. Its mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear, but somehow understood. Come see how deep the water goes. I reached toward the faucet handle, though I wasn't sure if I intended to turn it off or plunge my head into the stream. My hand trembled as it moved through the air, and I realized that I'd been trembling for some time now, not from fear, but from something else. Anticipation, maybe, or recognition. The water continued to flow, creating its impossible reflection of an impossible place. And somewhere in the building above me, I was certain that another version of myself was standing in another bathroom, watching another stream of water that didn't wet, seeing another reflection that showed a world where water behaved the way water should. How many versions of this moment were happening simultaneously? How many apart hotels existed in the spaces between the one I thought I knew, and in how many of them was I making the same choice I was about to make? The water whispered secrets in a language older than words, and I leaned closer to listen. Outside my bathroom window, it began to rain, drops that would evaporate before they hit the ground, in a precipitation that would leave no trace of its passing. The building settled around me with its familiar groans and whispers, welcoming me deeper into its collection of mysteries. I realized I was no longer certain which side of the reflection was real, and I realized I no longer cared. Story 5. The digital clock's red numerals burned into my retinas. 3:33 a.m. Something had pulled me from sleep, though I couldn't remember what. The corporate tower's 40th floor held an unnatural stillness, the kind that made your skin crawl with the certainty that you weren't alone. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Chicago's skyline stretched endlessly, its lights blinking like distant stars in an urban void. Marcus slept soundly in the bed across from mine, his breathing deep and undisturbed. We'd been sharing this company-provided accommodation for 3 months now, part of some cost-cutting initiative that paired junior executives in these glass towers downtown. The arrangement worked fine during daylight hours, but nights had become increasingly unsettling. I shifted under the crisp hotel-grade sheets, my eyes adjusting to the ambient glow from the street below. The mirrored closet door at the foot of our beds reflected the room in perfect detail. 2 beds, 2 sleeping figures, the sleek modern furniture that came standard with these corporate units. Everything exactly as it should be, except it wasn't. My heart seized as I stared at the reflection. Between our beds, where nothing but empty carpet should exist, stood a man. Tall, wearing what appeared to be a dark suit, his face obscured by shadows that seemed too deep for the room's lighting. He stood perfectly still, his presence so vivid in the mirror that I instinctively turned to look at the actual space. Empty. Nothing but the geometric pattern of the carpet and the subtle gleam of polished wood furniture. I whipped my head back to the mirror. The figure remained, unchanged, as if he'd been there for hours. My pulse hammered against my eardrums, drowning out the tower's ambient hum. This couldn't be happening. Mirrors didn't lie. They reflected what existed, nothing more. But the space between our beds was vacant. I blinked hard, squeezing my eyes shut for what felt like an eternity before opening them again. The mirror showed the same impossible scene. The stranger stood motionless, though something about his posture suggested an awareness of being watched. My breathing became shallow, each inhalation feeling inadequate. The room's temperature seemed to drop several degrees. I pulled the covers higher, my fingers trembling as they gripped the fabric. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the sudden chill. The corporate tower's heating system hummed softly, but it couldn't combat whatever coldness emanated from that reflected presence. I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Stress from the new job, maybe. The merger had everyone working 16-hour days, surviving on coffee and ambition. Sleep deprivation could cause hallucinations. I'd read about that somewhere. But this felt too real, too detailed to dismiss as a tired mind's invention. The digital clock pulsed, 3:33 a.m. Something was wrong with that too. I'd been awake for what felt like 10 minutes, yet the time hadn't changed. The red numbers held steady, as if time itself had frozen at this precise moment. I stared at the clock, willing the minutes to advance, but the display remained locked in that single instant. Then I saw it, the seconds. They were counting backwards. 3:33:59, 3:33:58, 3:33:57. My stomach lurched. Clocks didn't run in reverse. Electronics didn't malfunction in such specific ways. Yet there it was, each second ticking backward towards some unknown destination. The red numerals seemed to pulse brighter with each backwards tick, casting shifting shadows across the walls. I forced myself to look back at the mirror. The figure had moved. Not far, perhaps a single step closer to Marcus's bed. But the movement was impossible because I'd been watching. Mirrors couldn't show actions that hadn't occurred. Yet somehow, in the brief moment I'd looked away, the reflected stranger had advanced. My throat constricted. I tried to call out to Marcus, but only a strangled whisper emerged. His name died in my throat as if the very air had thickened, becoming too dense for sound to travel properly. The silence in the room felt oppressive, weighted with an expectancy that made my skin crawl. I decided to test something. Keeping my eyes fixed on the mirror, I slowly closed them. The darkness behind my eyelids offered no comfort. Instead, it felt like stepping into a void where anything might be waiting. I counted to 3 and opened them. The figure had taken another step. Now he stood directly beside Marcus's bed, though the actual space remained empty. I could see Marcus's sleeping form clearly in both the room and the reflection, but only the mirror showed the dark presence looming over him. The stranger's head was tilted downward, as if studying my colleague's face. Panic clawed at my chest. I had to wake Marcus, had to warn him about whatever impossibility was unfolding in our reflection. But my voice remained trapped, my vocal cords paralyzed by fear and disbelief. The room's silence felt absolute, as if we existed in a soundproof bubble where normal laws no longer applied. The clock continued its backwards journey. 3:33:43, 3:33:42, 3:33:41. I realized with growing horror that I was trapped in a temporal loop of some kind. Every second that passed took us further from the moment I'd awakened, deeper into this backward spiral where reflected strangers could exist and time ran in reverse. The corporate tower around us felt increasingly unstable, as if the very foundations were shifting beneath our feet. I couldn't close my eyes again. Each time I did, the figure advanced another step, but watching continuously was becoming unbearable. My eyes burned from staring without blinking, tears streaming down my cheeks as I forced myself to keep them open. The strain was enormous, like holding weights that grew heavier with each passing moment. The reflected stranger began to turn. Slowly, impossibly slowly, his head rotated toward the mirror's surface. Toward me. His face remained shadowed, but I could feel his attention shifting, focusing with an intensity that made my blood feel like ice water. Whatever this entity was, it knew I could see it. It was aware of my vigil, and somehow that awareness changed everything. The temperature plummeted further. My breath became visible in small puffs that dissipated quickly in the suddenly Arctic air. The corporate tower's windows began to fog at the edges, as if the outside world was becoming increasingly distant. We were being isolated, cut off from reality in ways I couldn't comprehend. I tried to stand, to move toward Marcus's bed, but my body wouldn't respond. My limbs felt weighted down, as if gravity had intensified around our section of the building. The effort to sit up left me gasping, my muscles burning with exhaustion that made no sense. I'd been lying still, yet felt as if I'd been running for hours. The clock read 3:33:27, 3:33:26, 3:33:25. How long could this continue? How far back would time retreat before something snapped? The backwards progression felt purposeful, as if we were approaching some crucial moment in reverse. But what moment? What event was being undone by this temporal regression? In the mirror, the stranger's face slowly emerged from shadow. It was Marcus. But not Marcus as he lay sleeping beside me. This was Marcus as he might appear years from now, or as he might have appeared if he'd made different choices. His features were familiar yet wrong, sharper, more angular, marked by experiences that hadn't happened yet or might never happen. His eyes held a depth that the real Marcus's didn't possess, as if this reflected version had lived through things my colleague couldn't imagine. The reflected Marcus smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. It was the smile of someone who knew secrets, who understood things that would drive others mad. His lips moved, speaking words I couldn't hear, but somehow felt in my bones. The silent communication carried promises and threats in equal measure, implications that made my sanity feel fragile as glass. I forced myself to look at the real Marcus. He remained asleep, peaceful and unaware. His breathing was steady, his expression serene. There was no indication that he knew his reflection had achieved independent existence, no sign that he felt the cold or sensed the temporal distortion surrounding us. When I looked back at the mirror, both versions of Marcus were staring at me. The real one had awakened, sitting up in bed with confusion evident on his face. But his reflection continued to smile that knowing smile, standing while the actual Marcus remained seated. The disconnect was complete now. Reflection and reality had severed their connection entirely. "You okay?" the real Marcus asked, his voice seeming to come from very far away despite the room's compact size. I tried to answer, to warn him about what I was seeing, but the words wouldn't form. My throat felt sealed, my tongue thick and unresponsive. All I could do was stare at the mirror, watching two versions of my friend exist simultaneously in impossible contradiction. The reflected Marcus began to walk, not toward his own bed, but toward mine. Each step was deliberate, measured, carrying him across the mirror's surface, while the real Marcus remained seated, rubbing his eyes sleepily. The reflection moved independently, governed by its own will and intentions. The clock showed 3:33 Umbro 9, 3:33 Umbro 8, 3:33 Umbro 7. We were approaching some kind of terminus. I could feel it in the air, a building pressure that made my ears pop and my vision blur. The corporate tower around us groaned softly, as if the building itself was straining under forces it wasn't designed to withstand. Through the windows, Chicago's lights began to flicker, entire sections of the city blinking out and returning in random patterns. The reflected Marcus reached my bed. He stood there, looking down at me with that terrible smile, while the real Marcus continued to sit on his own bed, now asking me questions I couldn't hear properly. The sounds of the room had become muffled, distorted, as if we were underwater or sealed inside a pressurized chamber. Then the reflected Marcus reached out, his hand pressed against the mirror's surface from the inside, palm flat against the glass. I watched in fascination and terror as the mirror began to ripple like water, the solid surface becoming fluid under his touch. The reflection was trying to break through, to cross from the mirror world into ours. I found my voice at last, a scream tearing from my throat with enough force to shatter the oppressive silence. The sound echoed strangely, multiplying and folding back on itself until the room filled with my own voice calling from impossible directions. The clock hit 3:33, so everything stopped. The digital display froze. The reflected Marcus's hand remained pressed against the rippling mirror surface. The real Marcus sat motionless, his mouth open mid-question. Even the city lights outside held steady, no longer flickering but locked in perfect stillness. In that moment of absolute suspension, I understood. This wasn't the first time. The backwards clock wasn't counting down, it was rewinding. Every night at 3:33 a.m. we returned to this moment. Every night I awakened to see the stranger in the mirror. Every night time reversed until it reached this precise instant, then began again. But each cycle, the reflected Marcus grew stronger. Each repetition brought him closer to breaking through. The mirror's surface rippled more violently now than it had in previous loops, the barrier between worlds growing thinner with each rewind. I was the only one who remembered, the only one who carried the knowledge from cycle to cycle. Marcus slept peacefully each night, unaware that his reflection was slowly becoming something else, something that wanted to trade places with him. The clock began moving forward again. 3:33 and 01, 3:33 and 2, 3:33 and 03. But I knew what would happen at 3:34. The cycle would begin anew. I would awaken to see the stranger between our beds, and time would start its backwards journey again. Each loop brought us closer to some final moment when the reflected Marcus would succeed in crossing over. As the seconds ticked toward that inevitable reset, I wondered if anyone would notice when it finally happened. Would the real Marcus simply vanish, replaced by his mirror counterpart? Would I be the only one to know that something fundamental had changed? The reflected Marcus pressed harder against the glass, his smile widening. 3:33:59, 3:34 eerie. The digital clock's red numerals burned into my retinas. 3:33 a.m. Something had pulled me from sleep, though I couldn't remember what. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Chicago's skyline stretched endlessly, its lights blinking like distant stars in an urban void. Marcus slept soundly in the bed across from mine, his breathing deep and undisturbed. I looked at the mirror. The stranger was closer this time. Story 6. The ice machine hummed its mechanical lullaby at the end of Corridor C, a sound that had become as familiar as my own heartbeat during these 3 weeks documenting the abandoned Fort Meridian. The camera equipment needed constant care in this humidity, and the small refrigeration unit in my quarters had given up its ghost 2 days ago. So here I stood, at 1:03 a.m., plastic bucket in hand, waiting for the ancient Kelvinator to dispense its frozen offering. The corridor stretched behind me like a concrete throat, fluorescent lights flickering in their endless death throes. Most of the base had been dark since the military pulled out in '89, but this wing still received minimal power, enough to keep the essential systems running for the historical preservation team. Essential being a relative term, apparently, since the heat had been spotty and the phones worked maybe half the time. I pressed the dispenser lever and listened to the familiar grinding of gears within the machine's belly. The sound was different tonight, though, more labored, punctuated by sharp metallic pops that echoed off the painted concrete walls. The machine shuddered against my palm, vibrating with an intensity that made my teeth ache. Then it stopped. Not the gradual wind down I'd grown accustomed to, but an abrupt cessation that left the corridor unnaturally silent. Even the persistent hum of the overhead lights seemed muted, as if the air itself had thickened around me. I pressed the lever again. Nothing. A third time, applying more pressure until I felt the plastic give slightly under my grip. The machine convulsed once, a violent spasm that made the entire unit rock forward on its legs. The dispenser chute gave a wet cough, and instead of the familiar cascade of ice cubes, something else emerged. Flakes of what looked like snow, but wrong somehow. The particles didn't melt as they hit the linoleum floor, instead maintaining their crystalline structure with an unnatural persistence. I knelt down, extending my fingers toward the accumulating pile. The flakes felt cold, yes, but not wet. They maintained their form against my skin's heat, each one perfectly preserved as if frozen in time rather than simply temperature. More troubling was their arrangement on the floor. Not the random scatter I would have expected, but distinct patterns. Lines, curves, letters, specimen ready. The words formed clearly in the dry snow, each letter precisely crafted from the machine's output. I blinked hard, certain I was imposing meaning on chaos, but the message remained unchanged. My breathing quickened, each exhalation creating small clouds in the suddenly frigid air. I stepped back from the machine, my movement echoing strangely in the corridor. The sound bounced off the walls with an odd resonance, as if the space had somehow expanded while I wasn't paying attention. When I looked toward my room, 213, third door on the left, the distance seemed impossibly greater than it had moments before. That's when I heard the footsteps. Metal against linoleum, precise and rhythmic. Each impact rang with the distinctive timbre of military-issue boots, the kind worn by the soldiers who had once called this place home. But the corridor was empty. I could see its entire length from the ice machine to the exit sign at the far end, and there was nothing there. Nothing visible anyway. The footsteps continued, growing closer. I could track their approach by sound alone, measured, purposeful, belonging to someone who knew these halls intimately. The echo pattern suggested substantial weight, solid contact with the floor, yet my eyes registered only empty space moving through the sickly yellow glow of the dying fluorescence. My rational mind offered explanations. Old pipes expanding, settling foundations, acoustic tricks played by the building's angular architecture. But rational thought felt thin and inadequate as the invisible presence passed within arm's reach, close enough that I caught a whiff of something metallic and cold, like winter air filtered through surgical steel. The footsteps paused directly in front of room 213. I forced myself to look at my door, though every instinct screamed against it. The plain institutional surface that had shown only my room number for 3 weeks now displayed something else entirely. A digital panel had materialized where none existed before, its green LED letters spelling out a message that made my stomach contract. Thawing in progress. Please wait. Below the text, a progress bar crept slowly from left to right, currently showing 47% completion. As I watched, transfixed, it advanced to 48%. The display pulsed gently, like a mechanical heartbeat. I turned my attention back to the corridor, seeking some anchor in reality, but found only deepening strangeness. The walls seemed to stretch away from me with each blink, the exit sign receding like a star viewed through an expanding universe. The ceiling, which had been a comfortable 8 feet above my head, now disappeared into darkness that the fluorescent lights couldn't penetrate. The footsteps resumed, But now there were more of them. Multiple sets, varying in cadence and weight, creating a metallic symphony that filled the impossible space around me. Some marched with military precision, others shuffled with civilian uncertainty, all of them invisible, all of them real enough to produce perfect acoustic echoes off walls I could no longer see. I pressed my back against the cold concrete, trying to ground myself in something solid and familiar. The ice machine continued its mechanical breathing beside me, and I became aware that it was dispensing more of the strange snowflakes. They formed new words on the floor, messages that appeared and dissolved in sequence. Subject orientation, complete environmental conditioning, active memory, integration, in progress. Each message lingered for perhaps 30 seconds before the letters collapsed into random scatter, only to be replaced by the next. I read them with growing unease, though their meaning remained frustratingly opaque. Subject, environmental conditioning. The clinical language suggested medical procedures, but this was a historical site, not a laboratory. Or was it? The question hit me with uncomfortable force. How much did I really know about Fort Meridian's true purpose? The Historical Society had provided only basic information. Established 1952, decommissioned 1989, used for specialized training operations. The specificity of that vagueness suddenly seemed significant. I pulled out my phone, hoping to document what I was seeing, but the screen showed only static, white noise like an old television between channels. When I held it closer to my face, shapes seemed to move within the digital snow, suggesting forms that my mind insisted were faces, though I couldn't quite bring them into focus. The invisible footsteps had multiplied into a crowd now, filling the expanded corridor with the sounds of movement. Boots, shoes, bare feet slapping against linoleum, a parade of the unseen. Occasionally I caught fragments of other sounds, fabric rustling, keys jingling, what might have been muffled voices speaking words I couldn't quite distinguish. I checked the progress bar on my door. 63% complete. The mathematics of my situation were becoming clear, though I resisted the conclusion they pointed toward. The longer I remained in this corridor, the more the environment changed around me. The more it changed, the less certain I became about which version was real. The mundane quarters I'd called home for 3 weeks, or this impossible space that defied physical law. But there was a third possibility, one that I'd been avoiding since the footsteps began, that both versions were equally false, that I was experiencing neither supernatural phenomena nor architectural impossibility, but something far more disturbing. I thought about the documents I'd found while cataloging the base's archives, medical files with pages mysteriously redacted, personnel records that ended abruptly without explanation, requisition orders for equipment that didn't match any military specification I could identify. I'd dismiss these inconsistencies as bureaucratic confusion, the inevitable gaps left by hasty decommissioning. Now I wondered if I'd been deliberately naive. The ice machine gave another violent shudder, and this time the snowflakes spelled out something that made my blood feel thick in my veins. Photographer David Chen. Project Continuation authorized my name. They knew my name. But who were they? And how could a defunct ice machine know anything about me beyond the basic guest registration I'd filled out 3 weeks ago? I tried to remember the exact details of my application to document the base. Who had approved it? What organization had actually hired me? Whether I'd spoken to anyone in person or handled everything through email and anonymous phone calls. The memories felt strangely fluid, resistant to precise recall. I remembered driving here, carrying my equipment through these same corridors, setting up my temporary darkroom in the adjacent supply closet. But when I tried to pin down specific conversations or faces, everything became vague and uncertain. The progress bar had reached 78%. I made a decision that felt simultaneously inevitable and terrifying. I was going to wait. Whatever was happening in my room, whatever the thawing in progress meant, I would let it complete, rather than interrupt the process. Some deep instinct told me that opening that door prematurely would be catastrophic, though I couldn't articulate why. The corridor continued its expansion around me, the walls receding until they became suggestions rather than boundaries. The ceiling had long since vanished into darkness, and the floor felt increasingly insubstantial beneath my feet. Only the ice machine remained solidly real, its mechanical breathing providing the rhythm by which I measured time's passage. The invisible crowd had grown larger, their footsteps now creating a constant background percussion. Sometimes I thought I glimpsed movement in my peripheral vision, shadows that had no source, shapes that dissolved when I turned my head directly toward them. The air carried scents that shouldn't exist in this sterile environment: coffee, cigarette smoke, the particular mustiness of old books. At 85%, the ice machine's message changed. Neural pathway, reconstruction, nearing completion, artificial memory removal, preparing original timeline, standby for restoration, neural pathways, artificial memories, original timeline. The clinical language painted a picture I didn't want to accept, but could no longer ignore. I thought about the preservation project that had brought me here, how easily the assignment had fallen into my lap, how perfectly it matched my specialized skills in heritage photography. I thought about the gaps in my recent memory, the way certain details about my arrival seemed fuzzy around the edges. I thought about the 3 weeks I'd spent documenting empty rooms that might never have been empty at all. The progress bar reached 95%, and the quality of light in the corridor began to change. The sickly fluorescent glow was gradually replaced by something warmer, more natural. The walls, still impossibly distant, showed signs of different paint, institutional green instead of beige. The floor beneath my feet felt different too, more solid, bearing the scuff marks of heavy use rather than decades of abandonment. At 98%, I heard new sounds mixing with the invisible footsteps. Machinery humming, phones ringing, voices engaged in conversation. Not fragments or whispers this time, but clear human communication happening in spaces I couldn't see but somehow remembered. The progress bar hit 100%, and my door opened. The room beyond was not the sparse quarters I'd called home for 3 weeks. It was something else entirely. A space filled with monitoring equipment, observation screens, medical devices whose purposes I couldn't identify. Charts on the walls tracked vital signs, brain activity, something labeled experimental parameters in precise handwriting. But most disturbing of all was the bed in the center of the room, surrounded by IV drips and sensor arrays. A bed that was clearly designed for a patient rather than a guest. A bed that bore the unmistakable impression of recent occupation. I stood in the doorway, unable to move forward or back, as the truth arranged itself in my mind with inevitable precision. The photography project, the historical documentation, the 3 weeks of careful work, all of it constructed, all of it false. Built from artificial memories and sustained by careful manipulation of my environment. The real question wasn't whether I was experiencing supernatural phenomena or psychological breakdown. The real question was how long I'd been here, lying in that bed, while they ran their tests and fabricated my sense of time and purpose. And now that the fabrication was ending, now that the artificial memories were being stripped away, and my original timeline prepared for restoration, what exactly was I going to remember about my real life? What had they needed to make me forget so completely that they'd built an entire false reality to contain my consciousness while they worked? The ice machine behind me gave one final satisfied hum and ejected a last small pile of snowflakes. I didn't need to look to know what message they spelled out, because I could feel the knowledge settling into my mind like water finding its level. Welcome back, Dr. Chen Experimentation. Phase 1, complete Phase 2. Please report to Laboratory C. The corridor was no longer empty. I could see them now, the technicians, the researchers, the subjects like myself who had volunteered for something we'd all been made to forget. They moved with purpose through halls that were very much alive, very much in use, pursuing work that the official record would never acknowledge. I stepped across the threshold into room 213, no longer a photographer documenting the past, but a participant preparing for whatever came next. Behind me, the ice machine hummed contentedly, ready to dispense its reality-altering snow to the next subject who wandered down the corridor at 1 a.m., seeking something as simple as ice for their camera equipment. The door closed with a soft, final click, and somewhere in the walls, machinery began to hum with renewed purpose. Story 7. The first time I felt the tiles pulse beneath my feet, I convinced myself it was nothing more than the resort's ancient heating system working overtime. After all, Palazzo Terme di San Casciano had been drawing water from the Earth's depths for over 8 centuries. Surely some irregularities were to be expected. I was spending 3 weeks in Tuscany with my family, a graduation gift before starting university back in São Paulo. My parents had chosen this particular resort for its reputation: thermal waters that supposedly healed both body and spirit, nestled in rolling hills where olive groves stretched toward medieval towns. The kind of place where wealthy Europeans came to soak away their stress and pretend they were discovering authentic Italy. The indoor pool area had become my afternoon refuge. While my parents explored wineries and my sister photographed every conceivable angle of cypress trees, I found solace in the mineral-rich waters. The pool itself was an architectural marvel, Roman-inspired columns supporting a vaulted ceiling, with large windows offering views of the Tuscan countryside. Steam rose constantly from the water's surface, creating an ethereal atmosphere that seemed to exist outside of time. But it was the floor that first caught my attention. The mosaic tiles surrounding the pool were original, or so the concierge had told us during our arrival tour. Intricate patterns in deep blues and gold, depicting scenes of Roman bathers and mythological creatures. Beautiful, certainly, but there was something about them that made my skin crawl when I looked too closely. The figures seemed to shift when caught in peripheral vision, their expressions changing from serene to something else entirely. That Tuesday afternoon, the pool area was nearly empty. An elderly German couple occupied the far end, speaking in hushed tones about their upcoming excursion to Siena. The lifeguard, a local man named Marco, sat reading a newspaper while occasionally glancing at the security monitors. The rhythmic sound of water circulation systems provided a constant white noise backdrop. I had been floating on my back, eyes closed, when I first felt it. A warmth that seemed to emanate from below, different from the water's natural temperature. I opened my eyes and found myself directly above a section of the pool floor where the tiles formed a perfect spiral pattern. The design seemed to glow with an inner light, though I couldn't be sure if it was just the underwater lighting playing tricks. When I stood up, the sensation intensified. The tiles beneath my feet were noticeably warmer than they should have been, even accounting for the thermal heating. I moved to a different area and felt the temperature difference immediately, a clear distinction between normal warmth and something that seemed to radiate from within the stone itself. I spent the next few minutes walking around the pool's perimeter, testing different sections. The pattern became clear. Certain areas of the floor generated heat in concentric circles, as if responding to some underground source that had nothing to do with the resort's plumbing. The circles weren't random either. They followed the mosaic patterns, emphasizing certain figures while leaving others cold. Marco noticed my strange behavior and asked if everything was all right. I mentioned the temperature variations, expecting him to provide some technical explanation about the heating system. Instead, his expression darkened slightly, and he suggested I might be experiencing altitude sickness or dehydration. The resort was built on elevated ground, he explained, and the mineral content of the water could affect people differently. His dismissal only heightened my awareness. I began to notice other things. The way the steam seemed to move against the air currents, forming shapes that lingered longer than physics would suggest. The sound of the water circulation changed throughout the afternoon, sometimes producing what almost sounded like whispers in a language I couldn't identify, and always the feeling of being observed from somewhere beyond the windows, though the landscape outside remained empty except for the occasional bird or tourist in the distance. That evening at dinner, I mentioned my observations to my family. My father, ever the engineer, launched into a detailed explanation of geothermal systems and how underground springs could create irregular heating patterns. My mother suggested I was simply adjusting to the change in environment and shouldn't overthink natural phenomena. My sister barely looked up from her phone, more interested in editing her day's photographs than discussing my thermal floor theories. Their rational responses should have comforted me. Instead, they left me feeling isolated, as if I were experiencing something that others couldn't perceive or chose to ignore. The feeling persisted through the evening's entertainment, a folk music performance in the resort's main hall, and followed me to bed. Sleep came fitfully that night. I dreamed of underground chambers filled with figures from the pool's mosaics, their faces animated and speaking in voices that sounded like escaping steam. They gestured toward pools of water that glowed with the same inner light I had seen that afternoon, beckoning me to join them in their eternal bath. I woke several times, each awakening accompanied by the sensation that the room's temperature had shifted while I slept. The next day brought more tourists to the pool area, which somehow made my previous experience feel less significant. Children splashed in the shallow end while their parents chatted about sightseeing plans. The normal rhythm of resort life continued around me, and I began to wonder if my engineer father's explanation hadn't been correct after all. But as the afternoon wore on and the crowds thinned, I found myself drawn back to the same areas where I had felt the unusual heat. The sensations were still there, perhaps even stronger than before. This time, I noticed that the warmth seemed to respond to my presence, intensifying when I stood still and fading when I moved away quickly. Marco was absent that day, replaced by a younger lifeguard who seemed less observant. I took the opportunity to explore more thoroughly, mapping the hotspots and trying to understand their distribution. The pattern that emerged made no logical sense from an engineering perspective. The heated areas formed a complex design that seemed to spiral inward toward the pool's center, but the spacing was irregular, as if following some organic rather than mechanical principle. As closing time approached, I reluctantly left the pool area and returned to my room to prepare for dinner. But throughout the evening meal and the subsequent stroll through the resort's gardens, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had left something unfinished. The thermal patterns weren't just a curiosity. They were trying to communicate something. That night, after my family had gone to bed, I made a decision that would prove far more consequential than I could have imagined. I would return to the pool area alone and investigate without the distraction of other guests or the watchful eyes of staff members. The resort's corridors were dimly lit after midnight, creating long shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. My footsteps echoed despite my attempts to walk quietly, the sound seeming to carry farther than it should in the enclosed spaces. The familiar luxury of the daytime environment had transformed into something more ominous, as if the building itself took on a different personality after dark. The pool area was accessible through a side entrance that remained unlocked for guests with late-night thermal therapy appointments. As I approached the glass doors, I could see steam rising from the water's surface, more dense and purposeful than I remembered from the daytime visits. The underwater lighting cast shifting patterns on the walls and ceiling, creating an atmosphere that was both beautiful and deeply unsettling. I entered quietly and immediately noticed the temperature difference. The air was warmer than it should have been, even accounting for the heated water. But it wasn't a uniform warmth. It seemed to move in currents, brushing against my skin like invisible hands testing my presence. The water itself appeared different in the artificial lighting. Instead of the clear blue I was accustomed to, it had taken on a deeper hue, almost emerald in certain areas. The surface moved constantly, not with the regular patterns of the circulation system, but with what looked like organic undulation, as if something large were moving beneath. I approached the pool's edge cautiously, my bare feet immediately registering the temperature variations in the tiles. The hot spots were more pronounced now, forming distinct paths across the floor. But more disturbing was the sound, a low murmuring that seemed to rise from the water itself, barely audible but unmistakably linguistic in its rhythm. As I listened more carefully, I realized the sounds bore a resemblance to Italian, but not the modern Italian I had been hearing from staff and other guests. The syllables were rounder, more archaic, like something from medieval manuscripts or ancient liturgies. The murmuring rose and fell in waves, sometimes becoming clear enough that I almost thought I could distinguish individual words, then fading back into incomprehensible whispers. I knelt by the pool's edge, trying to determine the source of the sounds. The water was noticeably warmer than during the day, almost uncomfortably so. When I dipped my hand beneath the surface, I felt currents that didn't correspond to any visible water movement. It was as if invisible streams were flowing through the pool, carrying heat and sound from some hidden source. That's when I first saw the steam formations, rising from various points around the pool. Vapor began to take on shapes that lingered longer than natural physics would allow. At first, they appeared to be random swirls, but as I watched, they began to form more defined structures, tentacle-like appendages that moved with deliberate purpose, reaching toward the pool's edges as if searching for something. One of these vapor tentacles brushed against my ankle as I knelt by the water. The sensation was unlike anything I had ever experienced, not quite solid, but with a presence that was undeniably real. The steam felt warm and slightly damp, but also somehow aware, as if it were testing my reaction to its touch. I pulled my foot back instinctively, but the steam formation followed the movement, extending farther from its source point in the pool. Other tentacles began to emerge from different locations, all moving with the same purposeful motion toward the pool's perimeter. The murmuring in the water intensified, taking on what sounded almost like encouragement or invitation. My rational mind insisted this was some sort of hallucination, brought on by the mineral content of the air, the late hour, or perhaps a delayed reaction to the day's thermal exposure. But my body was responding to very real sensations. The warmth of the steam against my skin, the increasing heat from the tiles beneath my feet, and the growing sense that something in the water was trying to communicate with me. I stood up quickly, intending to leave immediately and return to the safety of my room. But as I turned toward the exit, I realized the floor had changed. The temperature variations were no longer subtle differences. They were now extreme contrasts between areas of normal warmth and sections that felt almost burning hot. The heated zones formed a maze-like pattern between me and the door, with only narrow strips of normally tempered tiles providing safe passage. The steam tentacles had grown bolder, reaching farther from the pool and moving with increasing coordination. They seemed to be herding me, cutting off certain paths while leaving others open. When I stepped toward one of the cooler tile sections, the steam would retreat slightly, but any movement toward the heated areas brought them closer, their touch becoming more insistent. I found myself playing a real-life version of the childhood game where floor tiles become lava. Except in this case, the heat was genuine and seemed to have its own intelligence. The safe path led not toward the exit, but in a complex spiral pattern that drew me closer to the pool's center. Each step required careful placement, as the boundaries between hot and cool areas shifted slightly as I moved. The murmuring from the water had become more distinct, resolving into what sounded like incantations or ceremonial chants. I caught fragments that sounded like Latin mixed with older Romance language elements, words that seemed to be calling me toward the water's edge. The steam formations moved in rhythm with these sounds, creating a hypnotic dance that made it difficult to focus on finding my way out. As I navigated the increasingly narrow safe zones, I began to understand that this wasn't random. The pattern was designed, purposeful, leading me through a specific sequence of movements. With each step, the connection between myself and whatever presence inhabited the pool grew stronger. I could feel it testing my balance, my resolve, my willingness to trust in the path it was revealing. The realization that I was no longer in control of the situation should have terrified me. Instead, I felt a strange calm settling over my thoughts. The fear was still there, but overlaid with something that might have been curiosity or even anticipation. Whatever was happening had been building since my first afternoon at the pool, and now it was reaching some sort of culmination. The steam tentacles had multiplied, forming an almost solid barrier around the areas I had already traversed, while leaving the forward path clear. Looking back toward the entrance, I could see that return was no longer possible. The heated tiles glowed with an intensity that would have made crossing them impossible without serious injury. I was committed to following the path to its conclusion. The tile pattern led me through increasingly complex movements, requiring me to step backward, turn in place, and at one point balance on one foot while reaching toward the pool's surface. With each action, the murmuring grew more distinct, and I began to recognize repeated phrases that sounded like they might be names or titles in the ancient Italian I was hearing. As I neared the pool's edge, following the only remaining cool tiles, the water's appearance shifted dramatically. What had seemed emerald now revealed depths that extended far beyond the pool's actual dimensions. Looking down, I could see chambers and passages that couldn't possibly exist within the resort's architecture, illuminated by the same inner light I had first noticed in the tile patterns. The steam tentacles were no longer reaching toward me, but had formed a circle around the pool's perimeter, moving in a slow, hypnotic rotation. The murmuring had become a chorus, with multiple voices speaking in harmony, sometimes overlapping, sometimes responding to each other in what sounded like ritual dialogue. I reached the final tile, a small hexagonal piece directly at the pool's edge that felt blessedly cool against my feet. From this position, I could see the impossible architecture beneath the water's surface more clearly. Columns and arches that belonged to structures far older than the resort, inhabited by figures that moved with the same fluid grace as the steam formations above. The voices were calling to me now, not in the ancient language but in Portuguese, speaking my name and inviting me to join them in their eternal thermal embrace. They promised knowledge of the underground chambers, understanding of the forces that had drawn me to this place, and relief from the confusion and isolation I had felt since my first encounter with the heated tiles. All I had to do was step forward into the water. The logical part of my mind screamed warnings about thermal shock, about the impossibility of what I was seeing, about the need to find help for what was clearly a psychological break from reality. But the larger part of me, the part that had been responding to the pool's call since that first afternoon, understood that this was not about logic or possibility. I stood on that final tile for what felt like hours, though it could have been minutes or seconds. The choice before me was clear: step into the water and discover what lay beneath, or find some way to break free from the pattern that had brought me to this point. The decision came not through rational thought, but through a shift in perception that I still cannot adequately describe. The steam formations suddenly appeared not as supernatural entities, but as natural phenomena shaped by my own anxiety and over-imagination. The murmuring resolved itself into the familiar sounds of water circulation and building systems that I had simply misinterpreted in my heightened state of awareness. The pool was just a pool. The tiles were just tiles. And I was a Brazilian teenager standing alone in a resort's thermal area in the middle of the night, having let my imagination run away with me after too many days of unusual sensory experiences. I stepped backward from the pool's edge, moving carefully but no longer believing the tiles could harm me. The path to the exit remained clear, as it had been all along. The temperature variations were still there, but they no longer seemed threatening, just quirks of an old building's heating system, exactly as my father had explained. I made my way to the door and left the pool area, returning to my room with a mixture of relief and embarrassment. The whole episode felt like something between a waking dream and a panic attack, brought on by too much heat, too much solitude, and too much time to overthink natural phenomena. The next morning, I mentioned the experience to my family in carefully edited terms, describing it as a late-night walk that had left me feeling disoriented. My mother suggested I might be dehydrated and recommended limiting my time in the thermal pools. My father repeated his explanations about geothermal systems. My sister continued editing her photographs. I spent the remaining days of our vacation avoiding the pool area during the late afternoon and evening hours when I had first noticed the unusual sensations. During the busy daytime periods, everything seemed perfectly normal. Other guests continued to enjoy the thermal waters without apparent concern. Marco returned to his lifeguard duties and showed no signs of recognizing me as the person who had asked about temperature variations. By the time we departed for the airport, I had convinced myself that the entire experience had been a combination of travel stress, cultural displacement, and overactive imagination. The rational explanations my family had provided fit all the observable facts. There was no reason to believe anything supernatural or even particularly unusual had occurred. But as our taxi pulled away from Palazzo Terme di San Casciano, I turned for one last look at the building where I had spent 3 weeks recovering from what I now understood to be a minor psychological episode. The afternoon sun was striking the windows of the pool area, and for just a moment, I could swear I saw steam formations moving behind the glass, tentacles of vapor reaching toward the windows as if trying to follow our departure. The vision lasted only seconds before the building disappeared behind a hill, leaving me with nothing but the memory of a strange few days when I had allowed my imagination to transform a perfectly ordinary thermal resort into something far more mysterious. That was 6 months ago. I've been back in São Paulo since then, starting university and settling into a routine that should have put the Tuscany experience firmly in the past. For the most part, it has. I rarely think about the pool or the tiles or the steam formations that I now understand were products of my own stressed mental state. But sometimes, late at night when I'm alone in my apartment, I find myself running water in the bathroom sink and watching the steam rise from the hot tap. And sometimes when the conditions are just right, I swear I can still hear murmuring in that ancient Italian dialect, still feel warmth that seems to emanate from beneath the floor tiles. My rational mind insists these are just lingering psychological effects from my episode in Tuscany, neural pathways that were established during that period of heightened stress, and continue to fire occasionally in response to similar sensory triggers. There's no reason to believe that anything I experienced was real in any objective sense, but I've learned something about rationality and explanation that I didn't understand before my time at the resort. Sometimes the most logical explanation is also the most incomplete one. Sometimes the things we dismiss as imagination or stress response are actually perceptions of realities we don't yet have frameworks to understand. I still don't know what I encountered in that pool area. I may never know, but I've stopped trying to explain it away completely, because I've realized that the need to explain away mystery is often just another form of fear. Fear of admitting that our understanding of the world might be more limited than we like to believe. The steam still rises from my bathroom sink, and sometimes it still forms shapes that linger longer than they should. The floor tiles in my apartment sometimes feel warmer in certain spots, following patterns that don't correspond to any heating system. And occasionally, in the very quiet moments before sleep, I hear whispers in languages I don't recognize, but somehow understand. Whether these experiences are real or imaginary has become less important than what they've taught me about the boundaries between the two. Reality, I've learned, is not always as solid as the tiles beneath our feet. And sometimes the most dangerous game we can play is the one where we insist on standing only on what we consider safe ground. The invitation from Tuscany remains open, carried now in steam and whisper rather than heated stone. Someday, I think, I may be ready to accept it, but not yet. Story 8. The shrill pierce of the hotel phone dragged me from sleep like fingernails on glass. My hand fumbled across the nightstand, knocking over an empty water bottle before finding the receiver. Hello? My voice came out thick and gravelly. Nerb, nerb, nerb. The voice was hollow, distant, like someone speaking through water. It took several repetitions before my sleep-addled brain processed what I was hearing. My name, Brian, but backwards. Who is this? I sat up straighter, the fog of sleep burning away. Hello? The line went dead. I held the receiver against my ear for another moment, listening to the dial tone's mechanical hum. The digital clock on the nightstand glowed 3:17 a.m. in angry red numbers. Outside, Seattle's rain tapped against the window with the persistence of tiny, desperate fingers. I'd been in this city for 3 days, consulting on the Morrison Building's electrical overhaul. The Grandview Hotel was nothing special, a mid-tier business establishment with thin walls and thinner coffee, but it was close to the job site, and the company was paying. Now, lying in the darkness with my heart still hammering from the strange call, the familiar became alien. Sleep wouldn't return. That voice kept echoing in my head, the backwards pronunciation of my name carrying an intimacy that made my skin crawl. I'd received wrong number calls before, drunk dials, even the occasional prank, but nothing like this. The caller had known my name. By 3:45, I gave up on sleep entirely. I pulled on jeans and a t-shirt, deciding to explore the hotel's vending machines. Maybe some caffeine would help reset my brain, or at least give me something to do until dawn. The hallway stretched before me like a throat, lit by sickly fluorescent strips that cast everything in an institutional pallor. The carpet was that generic hotel pattern designed to hide stains, burgundy swirls on beige that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. My bare feet made soft padding sounds against the thin material. The vending machines were located at the far end of the corridor, near the elevator bank. As I walked, I became aware of an odd quality to the silence. Not true quiet. The building hummed with the white noise of HVAC systems and distant traffic, but something underneath, like the absence of something that should have been there. Halfway to my destination, I noticed the first phone. It sat on a small table beneath a generic landscape painting, one of those courtesy phones hotels provide for guest convenience. The receiver hung at an odd angle, not quite on the hook. I lifted it, expecting a dial tone. Nothing. No hum of an open line, no static, not even the electronic silence that indicated a working but unused connection. The phone was completely dead. Curious now, I checked the next one, and the next. Every phone on the floor was the same. No power, no connection, as if someone had severed every line. A practical part of my brain, the engineer's mind that solved problems for a living, began cataloging possibilities. Maintenance work, perhaps, though it was unusual to disconnect an entire floor simultaneously. A power issue with the phone system, though the hallway lights worked fine. But even as I rationalized, something cold was settling in my chest. That call to my room. If all the phones were disconnected, how had it come through? I continued toward the vending machines, but my attention had shifted. The fluorescent lights above hummed their familiar tune, but now I noticed something else. One of the fixtures, about 10 feet ahead, was dark. As I approached it, the bulb flickered to life. I stopped. The light was bright, normal, casting its harsh white glow across the carpet and walls. I counted under my breath, timing it automatically, an engineer's habit. At exactly 43 seconds, the light went out. Coincidence? Had to be. Fluorescent bulbs failed in patterns sometimes, cycling on and off as their ballasts struggled. I resumed walking but kept counting. The next dark fixture lit up as I drew near. 43 seconds later, it died. Then the next. My pace quickened. Not quite running, but no longer the casual stroll I'd intended. Each light activated as I approached, held steady for exactly 43 seconds, then extinguished. Behind me, the corridor fell into segments of darkness, like a mouth closing. By the time I reached the vending machines, my hands were trembling. The mechanical hum of the refrigeration unit seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. I fumbled for change, fed coins into the Coke machine, and punched the button for anything with caffeine. The can dropped with a metallic thud that made me jump. When I turned back toward my room, the lights behind me were all dark, except for one. The fixture at the very beginning of the hallway, near the elevator bank where I'd started, was glowing. It cast a pool of white light on the carpet, illuminating the space with crystalline clarity. And there, sharp and black against the burgundy pattern, was a shadow. My shadow. I looked down at myself, then back at the distant light. I was standing 60 feet away, surrounded by darkness, but somehow my silhouette was projected there with perfect definition. Not just any shadow, unmistakably mine. The slightly hunched shoulders from years of leaning over blueprints, the cowlick that made my hair stick up on one side, even the way I favored my left foot where I'd broken my ankle in college. But shadows need bodies to cast them. They need light sources and objects to interrupt them. Basic physics, as fundamental as gravity. I raised my right hand. The shadow raised its right hand. I took a step forward. The shadow took a step forward. The distance between us never changed. My breath came in short, sharp bursts. The rational part of my mind, the part that understood electrical circuits and load calculations and the behavior of fluorescent ballasts, scrambled for explanations. Optical illusion, some trick of the light fixtures, perhaps a reflection system I hadn't noticed. Hotels sometimes installed unusual lighting for aesthetic effect. But even as I constructed these theories, I knew they were wrong. This wasn't a malfunction or a design quirk. This was something else entirely. I began walking back toward my room, keeping my eyes locked on that distant shadow. It moved in perfect synchronization with my steps, a dark mirror of my movement. The can of Coke in my hand felt warm now, though I could have sworn it was cold when it dropped from the machine. Each step brought new details into focus. The shadow wasn't just moving, it was anticipating. When I shifted my weight to take a step, the shadow shifted first, by just a fraction of a second. When I paused to study it more carefully, the shadow paused too, but held still a moment longer than I did. The lights I'd activated earlier remained dark. The corridor stretched between us like a tunnel, with my room somewhere in that black middle distance, and this impossible shadow waiting at the far end. I tried to remember the layout, how many doors between the elevator and my room, which side of the hall, any details that might anchor me to something real and concrete. Nothing came. The hallway felt longer than it had before, the doors spaced differently. Even the carpet pattern seemed changed, though I couldn't identify how. Halfway back, I stopped walking. The shadow stopped too, but it didn't stop when I stopped. It stopped when I decided to stop, in that instant before my body responded to the mental command, as if it was reading my intentions directly from my brain. I raised my left hand to my face, slowly, deliberately. The shadow raised its left hand to its face at exactly the same speed. But when I touched my cheek, feeling the stubble and the warmth of my skin, the shadow's hand hovered inches away from its face, not quite making contact. The cold in my chest was spreading now, a numbing sensation that made it hard to breathe. I wanted to run, to sprint back to my room and lock the door and wait for daylight, but something held me frozen. The shadow was watching me, not waiting for me to move so it could mimic the movement, actually watching me. I could feel its attention like a weight, a presence that pressed against my consciousness. I closed my eyes, squeezing them shut so tightly that phosphenes danced behind my lids. When I opened them, the shadow was gone. The light at the far end of the hall had burned out, leaving the entire corridor in darkness except for the weak emergency lighting near the fire exits. I fumbled for my phone, using its screen to illuminate the path back to my room. The blue-white glow revealed the same burgundy carpet, the same beige walls, the same sequence of doors I'd passed before. Room 314. My keycard trembled in my hand as I slid it through the reader. The green light flashed, the lock clicked, and I was inside, throwing the deadbolt and sliding the chain into place. The room was exactly as I'd left it. My laptop on the desk, my suitcase in the corner, the rumpled bed with its cheap hotel sheets. Normal, mundane, real. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened the Coke, needing the simple ritual of a familiar action. The liquid was warm, syrupy, tasting of artificial sweetness and aluminum. I drank it anyway. The phone on the nightstand sat silent. I picked up the receiver and listened. This time there was a dial tone, steady, normal, reassuring. I called the front desk. Grandview Hotel, this is Marcus. How can I help you? The voice was young, professionally cheerful, utterly ordinary. Real. This is Brian Morrison in room 314. I was wondering about the phone service on my floor. Earlier tonight. Is there a problem with your room phone, sir? No, not my room. The courtesy phones in the hallway. They all seem to be disconnected. A pause. Computer keys clicking. I'm not showing any service issues, Mr. Morrison. All our phone systems are operating normally. Was there a specific call you needed to make? I can connect you to an outside line. No, that's fine. Thank you. I hung up and stared at the phone. Marcus hadn't hesitated when I mentioned the hallway phones. He'd checked his system and found everything normal, which meant either the phones were working, which I knew they weren't, or the front desk had no record of the courtesy phones at all. The rain against the window had stopped. In the sudden quiet, I could hear my own breathing, my heartbeat, the subtle creaks and sighs of the building settling. Normal sounds, ordinary sounds. But underneath them, so faint I might have been imagining it, was something else. A rhythm that didn't match my heartbeat, or the building's movements, like footsteps in the hallway outside, pacing back and forth in front of my door. I approached the peephole slowly, afraid of what I might see but unable to resist looking. The hallway was empty, lit by those same fluorescent strips that had malfunctioned earlier. Everything was normal now, the lights all working, the carpet the same ugly burgundy pattern it had always been. Except for one thing. On the carpet directly in front of my door, barely visible through the peephole's distorted lens, was a shadow. Just a shadow, with no source to cast it. It was smaller than the one I'd seen at the end of the hall, more compressed, as if someone was standing very close to my door. As I watched, it moved. A subtle shift, like someone adjusting their weight from one foot to the other, waiting. I backed away from the door, my mouth dry despite the coke. The shadow was outside my room. The voice on the phone had known my name. The lights had responded to my presence with mechanical precision. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a small voice was asking the question I didn't want to consider. What if the shadow wasn't following me? What if I was following it? I returned to the bed and pulled the covers up to my chin, keeping my eyes fixed on the door. The deadbolt was secure, the chain in place. Whatever was out there couldn't get in. Wouldn't get in. But as I lay there in the darkness, listening to the absence of sound from the hallway, I began to wonder if the real question wasn't whether it could get in. The real question was whether I was already out there with it. When I finally slept, I dreamed of corridors that stretched forever, lit by lights that turned on and off in perfect rhythm, casting shadows of things that shouldn't exist. And in the dream, I was walking toward something I couldn't see, following footprints that looked exactly like my own. I woke to the phone ringing. This time, I didn't answer. Story 9. The Riverside Inn squatted against the muddy banks of the Brazos, like something that had crawled out of the water and never quite dried. I'd found it through a desperate late-night search for affordable housing near campus, the kind of place that charged by the week and didn't ask too many questions about credit scores or references. The booking photos had been generous with the lighting. Standing in the lobby that first afternoon, I could smell decades of cigarette smoke embedded in the wallpaper's faded roses, mingling with something else, something organic and damp that seemed to seep up from between the floorboards. The desk clerk, a woman whose age could have been anywhere between 50 and 70, handed me a brass key attached to a plastic fob shaped like a riverboat. "Room 247, she said, her voice carrying the weight of East Texas humidity. "Second floor, end of the hall. You'll hear the river at night, but you'll get used to it." The stairs groaned under my feet as I hauled my duffel bag and laptop case up to the second floor. The hallway stretched ahead of me, lit by fluorescent bulbs that hummed and flickered with neurotic energy. Room 247 sat at the far end, just as promised, its door bearing the scars of countless openings and closings. The key turned with surprising ease, and I stepped into what would be my home for the next semester. The room was larger than I'd expected. 2 double beds separated by a nightstand, a small table beneath the window, and a bathroom that had seen better decades. The carpet was a mottled brown that might have once been burgundy, stretched between the beds in a pattern that reminded me of veins under skin. I dropped my bags on the bed closest to the window and began the ritual of making a temporary space feel like home. Textbooks stacked on the table, laptop charger snaking across the floor, clothes hung in the narrow closet that smelled of mothballs and forgotten summers. It was while I was kneeling beside my duffel bag, pulling out my last few shirts, that I first felt it. The carpet beneath my knees gave slightly, not with the usual compression of padding, but with something else, a gentle yielding that felt almost responsive. I shifted my weight, pressing down harder, and felt the distinct impression that something was pressing back from underneath. I sat back on my heels, staring down at the unremarkable carpet. The afternoon light streaming through the window cast everything in shades of amber and dust. I pressed my palm flat against the spot where I'd been kneeling. The carpet surface remained perfectly intact, but underneath I could feel the unmistakable shape of an impression, as if someone had stepped there and left their mark in the wood beneath. Standing quickly, I walked around the beds, my footsteps muffled by the thick weave. With each step, I felt that same subtle give, that sense of walking over ground that remembered every previous footfall. I knelt again and ran my hands across the carpet's surface. Nothing. No holes, no tears, no explanation for what I was feeling beneath my feet. The rational part of my mind, the part that had gotten me through calculus and into engineering school, offered reasonable explanations. Old buildings settled, floors warped, carpet padding compressed unevenly over time, but rational explanations felt thin in the amber light of that room, with the Brazos murmuring its secrets outside my window. I decided to look underneath. Getting down on my hands and knees, I worked my fingers under the carpet's edge near the wall. The material came up easily, as if it had been lifted many times before. Underneath, the hardwood floor gleamed with a patina of age, smooth and unbroken. I pressed my face close to the wood, breathing in the scent of old lacquer and dust. That's when I saw them. Footprints, not scratches or scuff marks, but actual impressions pressed into the wood itself, as if the floor had been soft clay when someone walked across it. They formed a rough path between the two beds, some overlapping, others distinct and clear. The prints were bare feet, average size, with the characteristic spread of toes that comes from walking without shoes. I reached out to touch one of the prints, my fingertip barely making contact with the smooth depression. The moment my skin met the wood, the impression vanished. I blinked, certain I'd imagined it, but when I looked again, the floor was perfectly smooth and unmarked. I let the carpet fall back into place and stood up quickly, my heart hammering against my ribs. The room felt smaller somehow, the walls pressing in with the weight of whatever history they'd witnessed. I told myself I was tired, stressed from the move and the start of classes. The mind played tricks when you were exhausted. That night, I lay in the bed farthest from the window, staring up at the water-stained ceiling and listening to the river's constant whisper. The sounds of the old building settling around me created a symphony of creaks and sighs, the kind of noise that becomes white noise after a while. I was almost asleep when I heard it. Soft footsteps, muffled by carpet but unmistakably real, moving across the floor between the beds. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tense, and listened. The steps were slow and deliberate, tracing a path from the window to the door, then back again. I could feel the subtle shift in the carpet's surface, the same yielding sensation I'd experienced earlier, but now it was moving in a steady rhythm around my bed. Without moving my head, I opened my eyes and stared at the carpet between the beds. In the dim light filtering through the curtains, I could see the surface rising and falling slightly, as if invisible feet were pressing down with each step. The pattern was methodical, a complete circuit around my bed, always the same distance from the edge, always the same measured pace. I wanted to call out, to demand an explanation, but my throat felt paralyzed. Instead, I lay perfectly still and counted the steps. 47 to complete one full circle. Then silence for exactly 3 minutes before the pattern began again. This continued until dawn. The next morning I examined the carpet in daylight, searching for any sign of the nocturnal wandering. The surface was unmarked, showing only the impressions left by my own movements. I lifted the edge again and peered underneath, but the hardwood floor was smooth and unblemished. No footprints, no evidence of anything unusual. I spent the day at orientation, trying to focus on syllabi and campus maps while my mind kept returning to the room. Maybe I'd been half asleep, caught in that space between waking and dreaming where the impossible seemed real. Maybe the stress of starting college in a new place had triggered some kind of sleep disturbance. But that night, the footsteps returned. This time I was fully awake when they started, my phone showing 2:47 a.m. in glowing digits. The same pattern, the same 47 steps, the same 3-minute intervals. I found myself counting along, anticipating each footfall. The carpet's surface continued to shift and yield, creating visible impressions that disappeared as soon as the invisible feet moved on. On the third night, I tried to photograph the moving carpet with my phone's camera. The screen showed nothing but flat, motionless fabric, even as I watched the impressions move past the phone's lens. The camera couldn't see what my eyes were seeing. By the fourth night, I'd developed a theory. The hotel was old, built in the 1920s according to a brass plaque in the lobby. Decades of guests had walked across that carpet, their footsteps creating permanent impressions in the wood beneath. What I was experiencing wasn't supernatural. It was some kind of structural memory, the building replaying the echo of countless footfalls. The theory felt solid until I realized the footsteps were getting closer to my bed. The original circuit had maintained a consistent distance, roughly 3 feet from the edge of my mattress. But each night, the invisible walker moved incrementally inward. By the end of the first week, the footsteps were close enough that I could feel the mattress shift slightly when they passed by the head of my bed. I considered changing rooms, but something held me back. Partly it was the money. I'd paid for the month up front, and finding another place would mean admitting defeat. But there was something else, too. A growing fascination with the mystery, a need to understand what was happening in room 247. I started researching the hotel's history, spending my free time in the university library, poring over local newspaper archives and historical records. The Riverside Inn had been built by a cotton merchant named Augustus Whitmore, who'd lost everything in the crash of 1929. The hotel had changed hands dozens of times over the decades, serving various purposes: boarding house, extended stay residence, unofficial shelter for river workers and drifters. The archives revealed a pattern of short tenancies and frequent management changes, but nothing explicitly supernatural. No unexplained deaths, no recorded hauntings, no local legends, just the ordinary tragedies and small dramas of a place where people came when they had nowhere else to go. On the 10th night, the footsteps stopped directly beside my bed. I lay frozen, feeling the carpet compress just inches from my face. The impression held for a long moment, as if someone was standing there, studying me in the darkness. Then, slowly, it moved around the foot of the bed and up the other side, completing its circuit before beginning the pattern again. But now the walker was including my bed in its route. The next night brought a new development. As I lay listening to the familiar pattern, I began to notice other impressions forming in the carpet, not just footprints, but the shape of someone sitting on the edge of the empty bed. The mattress didn't dip, but the carpet beneath it showed the clear outline of a human form, complete down to the depression where heels would rest against the floor. I found myself imagining the invisible figure, someone sitting in the darkness watching me sleep, occasionally standing to pace their restless circuit around the room. The thought should have terrified me, but instead, I felt a strange kind of companionship. Whatever was sharing my room seemed as trapped as I was, bound to repeat the same patterns night after night. On the 15th night, I decided to test my theory. As the footsteps began their familiar route, I quietly slipped out of bed and positioned myself in their path. I wanted to see what would happen when the invisible presence encountered an obstacle. The footsteps approached steadily, and I braced myself for contact. But as they reached the spot where I stood, they simply stopped. The carpet compression ended abruptly, leaving no trace of the walker's passage. I waited in the darkness, my bare feet sensitive to every vibration in the floor, but nothing happened. After 10 minutes, I returned to bed. The footsteps resumed immediately, picking up their pattern as if I'd never interrupted them. This became my new obsession. Each night, I would try different experiments, standing in the path, placing objects in the way, even lying down on the carpet where the impressions formed. Each time, the presence would pause, wait for me to move, then continue its eternal circuit. It was during my 3rd week in the room that I began to suspect the walker was adapting to my presence. The footsteps started to deviate from their original pattern, taking small detours around places where I'd interfered, incorporating new routes that seemed designed to avoid my experimental obstacles. More disturbing was the growing sense that I was being studied in return. I would wake to find the sitting impression on the other bed perfectly positioned to observe my sleeping form. Sometimes I could swear I felt a presence leaning over me, close enough that I should have felt breath on my face. But there was never anything there when I opened my eyes. My grades began to suffer. I found myself staying awake all night, watching the carpet for signs of movement, then sleeping through morning classes. The rational explanations I'd clung to felt increasingly inadequate. Structural memory didn't account for adaptive behavior. Building settlement didn't explain why the phenomena only occurred at night, or why they seemed responsive to my actions. I began to consider more disturbing possibilities. Maybe the stress of college had triggered a psychotic break. Maybe I was hallucinating the entire thing, my mind creating elaborate fantasies to cope with isolation and academic pressure. The thought was almost comforting. Mental illness could be treated, but genuine supernatural activity offered no such hope for resolution. But if I was hallucinating, why were the details so consistent? Why did the footsteps always take exactly 47 steps to complete their circuit? Why did the presence always sit in the same spot on the empty bed? Delusions I'd read were typically more chaotic, less methodical. On my final night in the room, exactly 1 month after I'd first felt the carpet give beneath my feet, something changed. I was lying awake as usual, counting the familiar footfalls, when the pattern suddenly altered. Instead of beginning their circuit around my bed, the footsteps approached directly. The carpet compressed in a straight line from the window to my bedside, then stopped. I could feel the presence standing beside me, could sense the weight of its attention like heat from a flame. Then, for the first time in 4 weeks, I felt something else. The carpet at the foot of my bed began to compress in a new pattern. Not footprints, but shapes. Letters. Slowly, methodically, invisible fingers pressed words into the fabric. You see me. The letters held for a long moment, clear and unmistakable in the dim light, then faded as the presence withdrew. The normal pattern of footsteps resumed, 47 steps around my bed, but now I understood that I was no longer just an observer. I had become part of whatever was happening in room 247. The next morning, I packed my bags and checked out. The desk clerk seemed unsurprised by my sudden departure. She'd probably seen it before. As I handed over the brass key, she mentioned that 247 had been the hotel's most frequently vacated room for as long as she'd worked there. Guests never complain about anything specific, she said, filing the key away in its proper slot. They just move on. I found a dorm room on campus, expensive but normal, where the carpet stayed flat and the nights were silent. But sometimes, lying in my narrow bed surrounded by the sounds of student life, I find myself missing the Riverside Inn, missing the presence that had shared my sleepless nights, the invisible companion who had finally acknowledged my existence in those final moments. I wonder if the pattern continues without me, if the footsteps still trace their eternal circuit around an empty bed, waiting for the next guest to notice the carpet's strange responsiveness. I wonder if the presence remembers me, or if each new occupant represents a fresh opportunity for contact. Most of all, I wonder about those final words pressed into the carpet. You see me. Was it gratitude or accusation, relief or warning? And sometimes, in the darkest hours before dawn, I wonder if what I saw was real, or if room 247 had simply taught me to see what was always there, walking in visible circles around us all, leaving impressions that vanish the moment we try to touch them. The rational part of my mind still offers explanations. Stress-induced hallucinations, sleep deprivation, the powerful suggestion of an old building's atmosphere working on an impressionable young mind. But rationality feels thin when I remember the weight of that presence, the methodical persistence of those footsteps, the careful formation of letters in the carpet's weave. I never went back to confirm whether the phenomena continued after my departure. Some questions are better left unanswered, some mysteries preserved rather than solved. The Riverside Inn squats beside the Brazos, offering temporary shelter to those with nowhere else to go, and room 247 waits at the end of the hall with its carpet stretched between 2 beds, ready to yield beneath the weight of feet both seen and unseen. The river keeps its secrets, and so do I. Story 10. The brass elevator cage rattled to a stop on the 14th floor with the kind of mechanical wheeze that belonged in a museum. I'd requested the cheapest room available at the Paramount Grand, but the clerk, a gaunt man whose bow tie seemed to strangle him, had smiled with yellowed teeth and announced my complimentary upgrade to the Benny Goodman suite. His fingers, I noticed, trembled slightly as he handed me the ornate key. The hallway stretched before me like something from a fever dream, all burgundy carpet and gilt-framed mirrors that reflected my tired face in endless succession. Sconces cast amber light that seemed to flicker in rhythm with my heartbeat. I'd been on the road for 3 weeks, consulting for failing businesses across the Midwest, and exhaustion had become my constant companion. This hotel, with its Art Deco grandeur slowly surrendering to decay, felt like the perfect place to collapse for a few days. Suite 1427 announced itself with a brass nameplate beneath the number, Benny Goodman Memorial Suite, in honor of radio's greatest comedy duo. I paused, key halfway to the lock. Benny Goodman was a clarinet player, not a radio comedian, but fatigue made me dismiss the inconsistency. Hotels got their history wrong all the time. The door opened with surprising silence, revealing a space that seemed to exhale the musty breath of decades. The suite sprawled before me in shades of gold and deep emerald, furniture arranged with the kind of theatrical precision that suggested a stage set rather than living quarters. A massive oak desk dominated one corner, its surface polished to mirror brightness. Velvet armchairs faced each other across an ornate coffee table, while oil paintings in heavy frames lined the walls. Portraits of men in bow ties and suspenders, their faces frozen in exaggerated expressions of comedic surprise. I dropped my suitcase and stretched, working out the knots that 3 weeks of cheap motel beds had tied in my shoulders. The silence felt oppressive, pregnant with expectation. Through the tall windows, the city sprawled 15 stories below, its lights beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk. That's when I first noticed it. The painting directly across from the windows, a portrait of 2 grinning men sharing a microphone, seemed to shimmer. I blinked, attributing it to fatigue, but the distortion persisted. The reflection in the painting's glass showed the room behind me, but something felt wrong about the timing. When I raised my hand, the reflection followed a heartbeat later, as if the image had to travel some impossible distance before returning to me. I turned to face the painting directly, studying the subjects' faces. The brass nameplate read, Benny and Bill, Kings of the Airways, 1934-1938. Their painted eyes seemed to track my movement, pupils glistening with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I waved deliberately, watching the reflection in the glass. The delay was unmistakable, perhaps half a second, but in that gap, reality felt negotiable. Room service arrived as I unpacked, an elderly woman whose uniform hung loose on her bird-like frame. She set the tray on the coffee table with careful precision, arranging the items as if following some invisible choreography. When she spoke, her voice carried the faint trace of an accent I couldn't place. The gentlemen who stayed here before, they appreciated punctuality, she said, not meeting my eyes. Performance time was always 8 o'clock sharp, never a minute late. I wanted to ask what she meant, but she was already moving toward the door with quick, nervous steps. The lock clicked behind her with a finality that made me shiver. The food, roast beef and mashed potatoes that belonged in a 1940s diner, grew cold while I explored the suite. The bathroom featured a clawfoot tub deep enough to drown in, its faucets shaped like theatrical masks. The bedroom contained a 4-poster bed draped in heavy curtains that blocked out most of the city's glow. But it was the living area that held my attention, with its gallery of paintings that seemed to watch my every movement. By 9 o'clock, I'd settled into one of the velvet armchairs with my laptop, hoping to catch up on client reports. The Wi-Fi password, according to a card on the desk, was Showtime 1937. As I typed, I became aware of movement in my peripheral vision. Nothing dramatic, just the sense that objects were shifting when I wasn't looking directly at them. I set the laptop aside and focused on the coffee table. A crystal ashtray sat in its center, flanked by 2 brass candlesticks. I memorized their positions, then turned to face the window. When I looked back, the ashtray had rotated perhaps 15 degrees clockwise. The candlesticks remained exactly where they'd been. My heart rate spiked. I stood and walked to the desk, keeping my back to the seating area. In the polished surface, I could see the distorted reflection of the room behind me. As I watched, one of the armchairs seemed to rock slightly, as if someone had just vacated it. The movement was subtle enough to dismiss as imagination, but the brass studs along its arms caught the light in a way that made them look like watching eyes. I spun around. The chair sat perfectly still. The rational part of my mind, the part trained to analyze failing businesses and identify problems, suggested explanations. Old buildings settled, air currents moved objects, fatigue distorted perception. But rationality felt increasingly irrelevant in a suite where the paintings reflected reality with a temporal delay, and furniture arranged itself when no one was watching. I decided to document what was happening. The camera on my phone captured nothing unusual. The paintings looked normal through the screen, their reflections perfectly synchronized with reality. But when I played back the footage, static filled the audio track. Not the clean digital static of poor reception, but the warm crackle of old radio broadcasts. Underneath the white noise, I could swear I heard the faint echo of laughter and applause, the kind that studio audiences produced for live radio shows in the 1930s. I tried recording again, this time focusing on the furniture arrangement. The video showed my hands placing items in specific positions, but when I turned away from the camera, the audio exploded into static, punctuated by what sounded like rim shots and exaggerated ba-dum-ts sounds. The laughter grew more distinct, as if an invisible audience was responding to some performance I couldn't see. Sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt the weight of observation pressing against my consciousness. The paintings seemed to lean forward in their frames, their subjects straining to get a better view of whatever show I was unknowingly performing. The delayed reflections grew more pronounced, creating a temporal gap where my actions echoed back to me from some parallel moment. By 3 a.m, I developed a theory that felt simultaneously logical and insane. The suite wasn't haunted in any traditional sense. It was a stage. The radio comedians who'd once stayed here had left behind some kind of psychic residue, an expectation of performance that had soaked into the walls like cigarette smoke. The delay in the reflections wasn't supernatural. It was the universe's way of accounting for the time it took for my actions to be processed by this invisible audience, judged for their comedic value, and reflected back as entertainment. I found myself moving more deliberately, timing my gestures to the rhythm of the phantom applause. When I dropped my pen and it clattered across the floor, the audio static burst into appreciative chuckles. When I stumbled slightly getting up from the chair, the laughter intensified with what sounded like genuine delight. The realization hit me like cold water. I wasn't just staying in the suite, I was performing in it. The paintings watched with increasing intensity, their eyes tracking my movements with the focus of talent scouts evaluating a new act. The furniture rearranged itself between my glances, creating better sightlines for the invisible audience. Even the lighting seemed to adjust, casting dramatic shadows that highlighted my expressions and gestures. I tried leaving. The door handle turned, but the door itself remained sealed, as if the frame had shrunk around it. The windows, despite their apparent accessibility 15 floors up, wouldn't budge. The suite had become a stage, and the show wasn't over yet. By dawn, I'd stopped fighting it. I paced the room with the exaggerated movements of a vaudeville performer, my arms swinging in broad arcs that drew enthusiastic static from my phone's speakers. I told jokes to the empty air, timing my delivery to the rhythm of the phantom applause. I practiced facial expressions in the delayed reflections, watching myself perform for an audience that existed only in the gap between action and reaction. The brass nameplate on the door had changed when I finally looked at it again. Instead of Benny Goodman Memorial Suite, it now read, "Welcome to the show, starring," with my name etched below in fresh-looking letters that seemed to gleam with their own light. I don't know how long I've been here now. Time moves differently when you're performing, measured not in hours but in laughs and applause. The room service woman brings meals that I eat with theatrical appreciation, playing up my reactions for the invisible crowd. The paintings have been joined by others, portraits of performers I don't recognize but whose eyes follow my movements with professional interest. Sometimes I catch glimpses of them in the delayed reflections, shadowy figures in the audience seats that don't exist in the real room. They lean forward during my better bits, their enthusiasm crackling through the static on my phone. They've been waiting so long for a new act, for fresh material to break the endless loop of old radio shows that have been echoing through these walls for decades. The strangest part isn't that I can't leave, it's that I'm not sure I want to anymore. There's something intoxicating about performing for an audience that appreciates every gesture, every expression, every moment of spontaneous comedy that emerges from the intersection of exhaustion and acceptance. They're not a cruel audience. They want me to succeed. They guide me with their laughter, shaping my performance into something worthy of their eternal attention. My laptop battery died days ago, or maybe weeks. Time has become as negotiable as the furniture arrangements and the temporal delays in the paintings. What matters is the show, the endless performance that keeps the invisible audience entertained and prevents the suite from falling back into the crushing silence that drove its previous occupants to. Well, I prefer not to think about what happened to them. I'm getting better at this. My timing has improved, my physical comedy more refined. The static on my phone has evolved into clearer laughter, more distinct applause. Sometimes I can almost see the theater beyond the painting's glass. Rows of seats filled with appreciative shadows, a stage that extends far beyond the suite's walls. The door handle still turns, but I haven't tried it in what feels like months. Why would I leave when I've finally found my calling? The consulting work seems like a distant memory, a life that belonged to someone who didn't understand the true nature of performance. Here, in this suspended moment between one era and the next, I've become part of something larger than myself. The paintings reflect me with perfect timing now, and when I look into their glass, I see not just my own face, but the faces of all the performers who came before. We're all part of the same eternal show, the same endless performance that keeps the Paramount Grand's most dedicated audience entertained across the decades. Tonight's show starts at 8 o'clock sharp, just like always. Never a minute late. I've learned to appreciate punctuality. Story 11. The Silver Dollar Heritage Hotel wore its history like a dusty coat, threadbare in places, but stubbornly authentic. Sarah had chosen it for our anniversary weekend, claiming the restored 1880s mining hotel would be romantic in that rustic way. Standing in the lobby beneath oil paintings of stern-faced prospectors and dance hall girls, I felt more like we'd stepped into a museum exhibit than a getaway destination. The desk clerk, a weathered man whose age seemed to fluctuate with the shifting lamplight, handed me an actual iron key. Room 12, second floor. Mind the stairs. They creak something fierce after midnight. His eyes lingered on my face longer than necessary, as if memorizing features for some unspoken purpose. Our room held the scent of old wood and lavender sachets, with a four-poster bed that dominated the space like a wooden altar. Sarah immediately began photographing everything: the antique wash basin, the faded daguerreotypes on the walls, the window that looked out onto what had once been the town's main thoroughfare and was now just another stretch of desert highway. "Listen to that silence," she whispered, pressing her ear to the window glass. "It's like the whole world just stopped." I unpacked our bags while she explored, though there wasn't much to discover in a 12 by 15 room. The walls were thick timber, hand-hewn and darkened with age, and they seemed to absorb sound rather than reflect it. Even Sarah's movements felt muffled, as if the very air had grown dense with accumulated years. Dinner in the hotel's restaurant proved surprisingly good, though we were the only guests. The dining room stretched empty around us, filled with tables set for visitors who would never come. Our server, a young woman with an oddly formal manner, moved between the shadows like she was performing some nightly ritual rather than simply bringing food. "How many guests are staying here tonight?" Sarah asked as the woman refilled our wine glasses. "Just yourselves and the gentleman in room 7. Her voice carried an accent I couldn't place, something old-fashioned, like she'd learned English from antique books. The hotel feels different when it's full versus when it's waiting. After dinner, we walked the second-floor hallway, studying the framed photographs of the hotel's original guests. The corridor stretched longer than I remembered from our arrival, lined with doors that bore brass numbers ranging from 1 to 15. Most stood slightly ajar, revealing glimpses of preserved rooms beyond. each one a perfect snapshot of frontier life, complete with period furnishings and the kind of careful attention to detail that museums spend fortunes achieving. Room 7's occupied, Sarah noted, pointing to the only closed door besides our own. Wonder what the other guest is like. I pressed my ear to the door briefly, hearing nothing but the deep silence that seemed to permeate the entire building. Sarah laughed at my nosiness, but her laughter sounded thin in the narrow hallway, as if the walls were drinking up every sound we made. Back in room 12, we settled into bed early, both of us strangely exhausted despite the easy drive and simple dinner. The mattress felt softer than it had appeared, and the quilted covers carried a weight that seemed to press us down into sleep with unusual force. But sleep wouldn't come for me. Instead, I lay listening to the hotel's nighttime symphony, the settling of old timber, the whisper of wind through window frames that had warped over decades, the distant hum of what might have been heating pipes or might have been something else entirely. Sarah slept deeply beside me, her breathing steady and peaceful in a way that made me envious. That's when I heard the first scratch. It came from outside our door, a deliberate sound like fingernails being drawn slowly across the wooden surface. Not the random scraping of settling wood or the scurrying of mice, but something methodical and purposeful. I held my breath, counting the seconds between each deliberate score mark. 5 seconds, then another scratch, then 5 more seconds. The sound moved away from our door and down the hallway, maintaining that same measured rhythm. As it traveled, I heard the soft click and rattle of door handles being turned, one after another, each one tested briefly before moving on to the next. I slipped from bed and pressed my ear to the door, trying to track the progression. The scratching had stopped, but the door handles continued their sequence. Click, rattle, pause, then on to the next. Room 13, 14, 15, then silence. When I cracked open our door, the hallway lay empty and still, but at the far end, near room 15, the last handle was still moving slightly, as if something had just released it. I watched for several minutes, but nothing else stirred. No footsteps, no shadows, no sound at all. Returning to bed, I found the sheets unexpectedly cold against my skin. Sarah murmured something in her sleep and rolled closer, seeking warmth, but even her body heat seemed insufficient against the chill that had settled over the room. The sequence repeated an hour later. This time I was ready, lying awake and listening as the scratching began again outside our door, the same methodical pace, the same deliberate scoring of wood, followed by the progression of door handles being tested in order. But tonight I noticed something else. A faint metallic sound accompanying each handle turn, like the jingle of small chains or the rattle of delicate hardware. I counted the rooms as the sounds moved away from us. 1, 2, 3. But the sequence continued past 15, which should have been the end of the hallway. 16, 17, 18. Doors that didn't exist, handles being tested in rooms that couldn't possibly be there. When I looked out this time, the hallway appeared exactly as it had before. 15 doors, numbers clearly visible in the dim lighting. Everything precisely as it should be. Yet I could still hear the door handles turning somewhere beyond what I could see, in spaces that logic insisted were impossible. The cold hit me the moment I returned to bed. Not the gentle chill of night air, but something that felt deliberate and searching. It moved across the sheets like invisible hands mapping the contours of our sleeping space, lingering at the foot of the bed before sliding up along the edges where Sarah and I lay. I pulled the covers closer, but the cold seemed to follow the fabric, creeping underneath and around the quilted barriers, as if they were no more substantial than tissue paper. Sarah stirred beside me, unconsciously pulling her knees toward her chest, seeking warmth that wasn't there. The third night brought a change in pattern. The scratching began earlier, while Sarah was still awake and reading beside me. She looked up from her book with a puzzled expression as the sound started outside our door. "What is that?" she whispered. "Probably just the building settling," I said, though my throat felt dry as dust. But this time, the scratching didn't move away. Instead, it remained focused on our door, scoring the wood with increased intensity and frequency. The sound grew more complex, not just fingernails, but something harder and more substantial, like claws, or the tips of metal tools being dragged across the surface with deliberate precision. Sarah sat up in bed, clutching her book against her chest. That doesn't sound like settling. The door handle turned, not quickly, like someone testing it and moving on, but slowly and deliberately, as if whatever was outside had all the time in the world to examine every aspect of the mechanism. The brass hardware rotated a full 90 degrees before stopping, holding that position for long seconds before slowly returning to its original place. "Someone's trying to get in," Sarah breathed. I was already moving toward the door, though every instinct screamed against it. The handle turned again as I approached, and I could see the metal shifting in the dim light filtering through our curtains. But when I yanked the door open, the hallway stood empty. This time, however, I noticed something different. The other doors along the corridor, all of them, had their handles turned at odd angles, as if they'd been tested and left in various positions. Some pointed down, others hung at awkward angles, creating a random pattern that somehow felt deliberate and meaningful. "There's no one here," I called back to Sarah, but my voice sounded hollow even to my own ears. When I turned back to our room, Sarah was standing by the window, her face pale in the moonlight streaming through the glass. "Look," she said, pointing outside. Below our window, scratched into the dirt of what had once been the town's main street, lines crisscrossed in a pattern that looked almost like a map, or perhaps a floor plan. The marks were fresh, clearly visible in the pale earth, and they seemed to correspond roughly to the layout of the hotel's second floor. "Those weren't there yesterday," Sarah said with absolute certainty. As we watched, more lines appeared in the dirt, etching themselves into existence without any visible cause. They formed rectangles and connected pathways, building a detailed diagram that matched exactly what we could see from our elevated position: the arrangement of rooms, the hallway configuration, even the precise dimensions of our own window's placement. But the map included areas that shouldn't exist, extensions that stretched beyond the hotel's actual footprint, additional rooms and corridors that existed only in the scratched dirt below. And in the center of it all, a single point was being scored deeper and deeper into the earth, a mark that corresponded precisely to the location of room 12. "We should leave," Sarah said, her voice barely audible. But when we tried the door, our handle refused to turn, not stuck or jammed, but simply unresponsive, as if the mechanism had been somehow disabled from the outside. Sarah pulled at it desperately, while I threw my shoulder against the door itself, but the heavy timber construction held firm against our efforts. The scratching resumed outside, but now it surrounded us. Along the door, across the walls, even on the window glass behind us. The sound filled the room from every direction, a symphony of scoring and scraping that seemed to map every surface, every corner, every possible means of entry or escape. I understood then what was happening. Whatever was out there, and my mind recoiled from considering what it might actually be, was learning our space, not just the physical layout, but the patterns of our presence within it. How we moved, where we slept, which areas we frequented, and which we avoided. It was creating a map of us as much as of the building itself. The cold returned with renewed intensity, sliding across our skin like invisible fingers taking measurements. It lingered at pulse points, traced the outlines of our bodies beneath the covers, and seemed particularly interested in our faces, touching foreheads, cheeks, the area around our eyes as if memorizing features through sensation alone. Sarah gripped my hand so tightly I could feel her fingernails digging into my palm. "It knows where we are," she whispered. "It's been learning where we are." Outside, the door handles began their sequence again, but now the sound carried a different quality. Not the random testing of earlier nights, but the confident manipulation of familiar mechanisms. Each handle turned smoothly and precisely, held for exactly the right duration, then moved on to the next with the efficiency of complete knowledge. When the sequence reached our door, the handle turned with such smooth certainty that I knew beyond doubt our room had been mapped as thoroughly as all the others. Whatever was outside knew exactly how our lock mechanism worked, precisely what pressure was required, and had probably known for days. The handle paused in its rotation, held at that critical angle where just a little more pressure would release the catch entirely. In that suspended moment, Sarah and I pressed ourselves against the far wall, holding our breath and each other in the stifling darkness of our invaded space. But the handle slowly returned to its original position without completing the turn. The scratching faded away, the cold gradually lifted, and in the sudden silence that followed, I heard something that chilled me more than everything that had come before. Footsteps on the stairs. Not the heavy boots of the desk clerk or the measured pace of the dining room server, but something else entirely. The sound was wrong somehow. Too light in some places, too heavy in others, as if whatever was making them wasn't quite certain how human footsteps should sound. They reached the second floor and began moving down the hallway with that same methodical precision we'd come to recognize. But these weren't the sounds of someone walking past doors. They were the sounds of someone stopping at each one, pausing, then moving on with the satisfaction of confirmed knowledge. The footsteps stopped outside room 12. In the silence that followed, I realized that whatever had been mapping the hotel, learning its layout and documenting our presence, had completed its survey. The scratched lines in the dirt below formed a perfect architectural diagram. Every door handle had been cataloged and tested. Every room had been examined and understood. And now, armed with complete knowledge of this place and everyone in it, something was ready to begin the next phase of whatever it had come here to accomplish. The doorknob began to turn again, but this time there was no hesitation, no careful testing, just the smooth, confident rotation of someone who knew exactly how everything worked. Sarah's hand tightened in mine as we pressed ourselves deeper into the corner where two walls met, as far from the door as our small room would allow. But I knew it wouldn't matter. We had been mapped as thoroughly as the building itself, our location charted and recorded with the same methodical precision that had been applied to every door handle and corridor. Whatever was coming for us had taken its time to learn everything it needed to know, and now it was time for the next lesson to begin. Story 12. The altitude had been getting to me since I'd arrived in the Andes 3 days ago. That's what I told myself as I stood in the cramped room of the converted chalet, watching my breath form small clouds in the frigid mountain air. The hostel owner had mentioned that the heating was temperamental, but I hadn't expected the wall-mounted unit to look like something salvaged from a 1970s Soviet bunker. I pressed the power button, and the machine groaned to life with a sound like grinding metal. The noise settled into a steady rhythm, a soft whooshing that seemed oddly familiar. I placed my palm against my chest, feeling the steady thump beneath my ribs, and froze. The heater was breathing in perfect synchronization with my heartbeat. Altitude sickness, I reasoned, though the explanation felt thin even as I thought it. Low oxygen makes you hear things, see things. I'd read about it during my pre-trip research, but reading about hallucinations and experiencing the uncanny precision of that mechanical pulse were entirely different matters. The room began to warm, and I settled onto the narrow bed with my laptop, determined to catch up on emails that had been piling up since I'd left Sao Paulo. But concentration proved impossible. Every few seconds, my attention drifted back to that rhythmic whooshing, the way it seemed to anticipate each beat of my heart by just a fraction of a second, as if the machine was setting the pace and my body was following. I tried shifting positions, thinking perhaps the angle was playing tricks on my perception. The synchronization remained perfect. I held my breath, and for those suspended moments, the heater continued its steady cycle. But when I exhaled and my heart resumed its natural rhythm, the machine adjusted instantly, like a conductor bringing an orchestra back into time. By evening, I'd given up on work entirely. The other guests, a pair of German hikers and an elderly American photographer, had gathered in the common area downstairs, their voices carrying up through the thin floors. I considered joining them, but something about leaving the room felt wrong, as if stepping away might break whatever delicate equilibrium had been established between my body and the machine. The temperature outside had plummeted with the sun, and the heater worked harder now, its exhalations growing more pronounced. I could feel the warm air against my skin in waves, each pulse like a breath on my neck. The sensation was uncomfortably intimate, as if something invisible was lying beside me, sharing the small space. Around midnight, When the voices downstairs had long since faded, I noticed the first wisps of vapor. They emerged from the heater's vents like tendrils of fog, but instead of dissipating, they rose in deliberate spirals toward the ceiling. The patterns were too organized to be random, too purposeful to be mere physics. As I watched, transfixed, the vapors began to take shape. Not distinct forms, but suggestions of movement, like shadows dancing just beyond the edge of recognition. I sat up in bed, my heart rate increasing, and immediately the heater's rhythm accelerated to match. The vapor responded too, swirling faster, the shadow shapes becoming more animated. They seemed to be performing some kind of ritual dance, circling an invisible center point directly above my head. Pareidolia, I told myself, grasping for scientific explanations. The brain sees patterns where none exist. But even as I formed the thought, one of the vapor figures seemed to turn toward me, its undefined head tilting in what could only be described as curiosity. I reached for the bedside lamp, but my hand stopped halfway to the switch. Something deep in my primitive brain whispered that darkness might be preferable to whatever the light might reveal. Instead, I lay back down and closed my eyes, focusing on the steady rhythm of the heater, trying to use it as a meditation anchor. But behind my closed lids, I could still sense movement. The air in the room had taken on a different quality, thicker, more charged, as if a storm was building inside these four walls. The temperature fluctuated in ways that seemed impossible for a simple heating unit, waves of warmth followed by pockets of cold that moved across my body like invisible hands. Sleep came in fragments, broken by moments of startled awareness. Each time I surfaced from unconsciousness, the vapor shapes seemed to have grown more defined, more numerous. They no longer confined themselves to the ceiling, but descended partway down the walls, creating the impression of a crowd gathering in the upper reaches of the room. Near dawn, something changed. My heart had been beating steadily for hours in perfect synchronization with the machine, but suddenly, the heater skipped a beat, then another. The rhythm became erratic, unpredictable, and my body struggled to follow. My pulse quickened as it tried to match the new pattern, then slowed as the machine briefly fell silent, then surged again as it resumed with yet another timing. The vapor shapes responded to each change, their movements becoming more frenzied, more urgent. They seemed to be communicating with each other in a language of gesture and flow, pointing downward at me, then at each other, then toward the walls beyond my room. I sat up, sweat beading on my forehead despite the cool air. The sensation was like being the subject of a heated debate conducted entirely in whispers I couldn't quite hear. My chest felt tight, not from the altitude now, but from something else, a pressure that seemed to come from outside my body, as if the room itself was trying to impose its will on my cardiovascular system. This isn't happening, I thought, but the conviction felt forced. My engineering background demanded logical explanations, but logic felt increasingly irrelevant as the heater's rhythm grew more complex, more insistent. It was no longer following my heartbeat. It was trying to lead it, to pull my body into compliance with some pattern I couldn't understand. I reached for my phone to check the time and noticed my hands were shaking. The screen showed 5:43 a.m., but the numbers seemed to blur and shift as I watched them. I blinked hard, refocusing, but the same disorientation returned within seconds. Everything in the room appeared slightly off. Angles that didn't quite meet properly, shadows that fell in directions inconsistent with the single light source from the heater's glow. The machine's rhythm was becoming more aggressive now, each pulse carrying a subtle vibration that I could feel in my bones. The vapor shapes had descended further, some of them now at eye level, close enough that I could make out what might have been facial features, hollows where eyes could be, the suggestion of mouths opening and closing in silent conversation. I needed to regain control. The rational part of my mind insisted that this was nothing more than a malfunctioning heater, combined with altitude-induced hallucinations. All I had to do was turn off the machine, and everything would return to normal. I swung my legs out of bed and stood, immediately feeling dizzy. The room seemed to pulse around me in time with the heater, the walls breathing in and out like the interior of some massive lung. I steadied myself against the small desk and located the main electrical panel near the door. The metal cover felt ice-cold under my fingers as I pried it open. Inside, a single large switch controlled the power to the entire room. I grasped the handle, took a deep breath, and flipped it down. The heater fell silent. The room plunged into darkness. And then, from the corridor outside, I heard them ignite. One by one, with sounds like small explosions. Fireplaces that I hadn't even known existed began roaring to life. The noise came from both directions, left and right down the hallway, extending far beyond what I remembered of the building's layout. Each fireplace had its own rhythm, its own breathing pattern, and together they created a complex symphony of mechanical respiration. But these rhythms were wrong. They bore no relationship to any human heartbeat, operating instead on some alien timing that made my chest feel tight with the effort of resisting synchronization. The combined effect was like standing in the center of a vast respiratory system, surrounded by lungs that breathed according to laws I didn't understand. I fumbled for my phone's flashlight and directed the beam under the door. Orange light flickered in the gap, the glow of fires that shouldn't exist, fed by what fuel I couldn't imagine. The sound of burning was different too. Not the comfortable crackle of wood, but something more like the whisper of gas flames, constant and controlled. My heart was racing now, fighting against the competing rhythms that pressed in from all sides. Each fireplace seemed to be trying to impose its own tempo on my body, and the cumulative effect was making me nauseous. I could feel my pulse becoming irregular, struggling to maintain its natural pattern against the mechanical insistence of forces beyond the walls. I pressed my back against the door, as if the thin wood could somehow shield me from whatever was happening in the corridor. Through the barrier I could hear other sounds now, not quite footsteps, but something like movement, as if the vapor shapes from my room had multiplied and descended to walk the hallways. The orange glow under the door began to pulse, cycling through different intensities and patterns that hurt to follow. I closed my eyes, but the light was bright enough to penetrate my lids, creating a strobing effect that threatened to trigger something epileptic in my brain. This is a dream, I told myself. None of this is real. But the cold door against my back felt solid enough, and the sound of my own breathing, ragged and panicked, seemed too visceral to be imaginary. I tried the light switch, forgetting that I'd killed the power. The flashlight beam from my phone felt weak and insignificant against the pulsing glow from the corridor. In its pale light, I could see that the heater remained silent, its vents dark and still, but the temperature in the room was rising anyway, as if heat was bleeding through the walls from the impossible fires beyond. Minutes passed, or perhaps hours. Time felt elastic, unreliable. The rhythmic breathing of the corridor fireplaces continued, sometimes synchronizing briefly into a single massive inhalation, sometimes fragmenting into chaos. During the synchronized moments, I could feel my own body trying to match the pattern, my chest rising and falling in time with forces that existed somewhere between the mechanical and the organic. Gradually, I became aware that the sounds were changing, becoming more inhabited. What had started as simple mechanical breathing now carried undertones of something else. Whispers, perhaps, or the echo of distant conversations. The vapor shapes I'd seen earlier seemed to have found their voices, and they were discussing something urgent in languages that predated human speech. I found myself straining to understand, leaning closer to the door despite every instinct screaming at me to get as far away as possible. The words, if they were words, seemed almost familiar, like half-remembered fragments from dreams or childhood stories told in languages I'd never learned. As dawn light began to seep through the small window, the intensity of the phenomenon started to ebb. The fireplaces didn't go out all at once, but rather faded one by one, their rhythms slowing like hearts gradually stopping. The whispers became fainter, the orange glow dimmer, until finally the corridor fell silent. I waited another hour before opening the door. The hallway looked exactly as it had when I'd arrived 3 days earlier. A narrow passage with faded wallpaper and worn carpet, lined with doors to other guest rooms. No fireplaces, no scorch marks, no evidence that anything unusual had occurred. But when I placed my hand against my chest to check my pulse, I found something that made my blood run cold. My heart was beating in a rhythm I didn't recognize. Not the steady, familiar pattern I'd known my entire life, but something else entirely. Something that felt alien and imposed, as if my body had been reprogrammed during the night by forces that existed in the spaces between physics and psychology. I packed my belongings and checked out within the hour, offering no explanation to the confused hostel owner. As I loaded my rental car, I caught a glimpse of my room's window from the outside. For just a moment, I could swear I saw vapor rising from behind the glass, forming shapes that waved goodbye. The drive down from the mountains was uneventful, but the new rhythm in my chest persisted. It persists still, weeks later, back in the familiar chaos of São Paulo. My doctor finds nothing wrong. My heart is healthy, he assures me, beating with perfect regularity. But he's measuring the wrong thing. He's listening for the rhythm I used to have, not the one I carry now. Sometimes late at night in my apartment, I hear the heating system kick on, and for just a moment, I think I recognize the pattern it follows. The same alien timing that now governs the most essential function of my body. I've started wondering if I brought something back from the Andes, something that lives in the space between heartbeats, in the pause between inhalation and exhalation, something that has made a home in the mechanical rhythms that surround us every day, waiting for the right moment to remind us that we are never truly alone in the spaces we think we control. The heater in my apartment breathes differently now, or perhaps I'm the one who has changed, and I'm finally hearing what was always there, the sound of a world that operates according to laws we've never learned to recognize, conducted by a heartbeat that was never entirely our own. Story 13. The upgrade was supposed to be a courtesy. 23 years filming marine documentaries had earned me enough recognition that the Abyssal Pearl Resort offered their panoramic suite at standard rates. I should have declined, should have kept the modest cabin on level 2, where the pressure felt manageable and the darkness beyond the portholes remained safely abstract. But 40 meters down, suspended in the Indian Ocean's embrace, the panoramic suite promised the footage of a lifetime. Wall-to-wall acrylic windows curved around 3 sides of the spacious room, offering an unobstructed view into the abyss. During daylight hours, the external floodlights revealed an underwater garden, coral formations that defied imagination, schools of fish that moved like living clouds, the occasional reef shark gliding past with ancient indifference. The bellhop had explained the lighting system with practiced efficiency. External illumination activated automatically at sunset, controlled from the main station. Maintenance windows occurred bi-weekly, always scheduled for the early morning hours when guests typically slept. The backup emergency lighting would engage if needed, though such instances remained rare in the resort's 5-year operational history. I'd settled into the suite's rhythm easily enough. The gentle sway barely registered anymore, the entire structure designed to move with deep ocean currents rather than resist them. The constant whisper of water against acrylic had become a lullaby. My equipment filled one corner. Cameras, lights, waterproof housings, batteries charging in neat rows. Tomorrow's dive would take me to the thermal vents 3 kilometers south, where bioluminescent creatures gathered in numbers that defied scientific explanation. Sleep had come easily that first night, and the second. On the third night, exhaustion from a difficult shoot should have guaranteed another 8 hours of uninterrupted rest. My internal clock rarely failed me. Decades of pre-dawn shoots had trained my body to wake at precise intervals. But consciousness arrived abruptly at 1:17 a.m., not from any external sound, but from a wrongness that penetrated dreams and dragged me into wakefulness. The suite lay in perfect darkness. No gentle blue glow from the external floods, no subtle illumination from the corridor seeping under the door. The blackness felt absolute, pressing against my eyes like physical weight. For several seconds, I remained motionless, allowing my night vision to adjust while cataloging sensations. The perpetual whisper of water against acrylic continued unchanged. The gentle sway persisted, rhythmic and reassuring. Temperature remained constant. The suite's climate control maintained perfect consistency regardless of external conditions. Nothing seemed wrong, yet wrongness permeated everything. I reached for the bedside controls, fingers finding the familiar panel in darkness. The room's internal lighting responded immediately, casting warm illumination across polished surfaces and expensive furnishings. Through the curved windows, absolute darkness stretched beyond the acrylic, not the deep blue of ocean depths, but genuine void, as if the structure floated in space rather than water. The maintenance notice had mentioned this possibility. External lighting systems required periodic servicing, and such work occurred during minimal disturbance hours. The darkness would lift by morning, revealing the familiar underwater landscape. Yet something about the quality of that darkness felt different than simple absence of artificial illumination. It seemed too complete, too hungry. I approached the main viewing wall, where during daylight hours schools of tropical fish performed their endless dance. The acrylic stretched floor to ceiling, nearly 4 meters of engineered transparency designed to withstand pressures that would crush conventional glass instantly. My reflection stared back, a lean figure in cotton pajamas, graying hair disheveled from sleep, eyes wider than they should be. Behind my reflection, darkness pressed against the window like solid matter. Movement caught my peripheral vision. Not outside, the darkness remained absolute, but in the reflection itself. My mirror image appeared to shift slightly, as if the lighting had changed, though the room's illumination remained constant. The sensation lasted only seconds before returning to normal, leaving me questioning whether I'd seen anything at all. Fatigue played tricks on perception. 30 years of underwater filming had taught me that exhaustion, pressure changes, and unfamiliar environments could combine to create convincing hallucinations. The human brain, deprived of expected sensory input, manufactured its own entertainment. Logic provided comfort, but the wrongness persisted, a low-frequency vibration in consciousness that refused rational explanation. I returned to bed, but sleep remained elusive. The darkness beyond the windows seemed to pulse with subtle rhythms that didn't match the ocean's natural cadence. Several times I caught myself straining to hear sounds that weren't there, or turning toward movements that existed only in peripheral vision. The suite's familiar dimensions felt altered, as if the walls had shifted inward by degrees too small to measure, but large enough to notice. By 2:30 a.m., I abandoned attempts at rest. The coffee maker in the suite's kitchenette responded to familiar motions. Measure, pour, wait for the reassuring gurgle of brewing. While the machine worked, I organized equipment for tomorrow's shoot, checking battery levels and memory card capacity with the obsessive precision that separated professionals from amateurs. Routine provided comfort, anchoring consciousness to practical concerns instead of letting it drift toward less rational territories. The coffee tasted normal. The suite's climate control maintained perfect temperature. Nothing had changed, yet everything felt different, as if I experienced familiar sensations through altered perception. The darkness outside pressed more urgently against the windows, and I found myself avoiding direct looks at the acrylic walls, preferring to observe them through peripheral vision where their absolute blackness felt less oppressive. At 3:15 a.m., the first mark appeared. I'd been reviewing dive plans on my tablet, sitting at the suite's dining table with my back to the main viewing wall. The reflection of the room's lighting created a faint double exposure in the tablet's screen. My figure, the table, the kitchenette beyond. Normal reflections, predictable and comforting. Then something shifted in that reflected image, a variation so subtle I almost dismissed it as eye strain. When I turned to look directly at the window, the mark was there. A handprint pressed against the acrylic from outside, fingers splayed wide, palm flat against the surface. The outline was clearly visible, not as a reflection, but as if someone had pressed their hand against the glass and left an impression that caught and held the room's lighting. The proportions seemed human, but wrong in ways that made my stomach clench. The fingers stretched too long, joints positioned at angles that suggested additional segments. Where fingertips should have been, circular marks dotted the glass. Not fingerprints, but something else entirely. I approached slowly, heart rate accelerating despite rational attempts to control physiological responses. The mark remained constant, showing no wavering that might indicate reflection, or optical illusion. As I drew closer, details became more apparent. The circular marks at the finger ends displayed radiating patterns, concentric rings surrounding central points that resembled organic suction cups. 3 feet from the window, I stopped. The handprint covered an area easily twice the size of my own palm, positioned at shoulder height directly in front of where I'd been sitting. If someone had been outside in diving gear, the print would have been accompanied by other signs. Equipment lights, the glow of instruments, bubbles from breathing apparatus. The darkness beyond the acrylic remained absolute. I placed my own hand against the glass, matching the gesture but from inside. My palm aligned roughly with the center of the mark, but my fingers fell short of its extremities by several inches. The acrylic felt cold against my skin, vibrating slightly with the ocean's pressure. Through the glass, I could feel that vast weight of water, tons of liquid pressing inward, held back by engineered transparency that suddenly seemed impossibly fragile. The mark began to fade as I watched, not quickly, but with gradual dissolution that suggested retreat rather than simple evaporation. The suction cup patterns disappeared first, followed by the finger outlines, until only a faint suggestion of the palm remained. Then that too vanished, leaving unmarked acrylic that showed no sign of ever having been touched. I pressed my face closer to the glass, breath fogging the surface as I peered into the darkness beyond. Nothing moved in that absolute void. No lights, no shapes, no indication that anything existed outside the suite's illuminated bubble. Yet the handprint had been real, too detailed and consistent to dismiss as hallucination, too specific to explain as condensation patterns or optical effects. The coffee had gone cold. I prepared another cup, hands moving through familiar motions while my mind processed what I'd witnessed. Rational explanations existed. The resort employed maintenance divers for external repairs. Perhaps someone had been working on the lighting system, their hand leaving a brief impression before they moved on to other tasks. The unusual finger proportions could be explained by diving gloves, the suction cup patterns by specialized grip pads used for underwater work. But the general manager had been specific during check-in. No diving operations occurred during maintenance windows. The external lighting systems were controlled remotely from the main station, requiring no human intervention at depth. Safety protocols prohibited unauthorized diving in the resort's immediate vicinity, particularly during the early morning hours when emergency response capabilities were reduced. I contacted the front desk through the suite's communication system. The night manager's voice carried the practiced calm of hospitality professionals trained to handle unusual guest concerns. Yes, the external lighting was offline for scheduled maintenance. No diving operations were occurring. The maintenance was being conducted remotely through automated systems. Would I like security to perform a visual inspection of the area around my suite? I declined the offer. What would they find in that absolute darkness? How would they explain a handprint that had already faded, leaving no physical evidence of its existence? The suggestion that I might have imagined the entire incident hung unspoken in the conversation's pauses. After ending the call, I resumed my position at the dining table, but facing the windows this time. If the mark returned, I wanted to observe its formation rather than discovering it after the fact. The tablet screen showed dive plans and equipment checklists, but my attention remained fixed on the curved acrylic walls surrounding the suite. At 4:27 a.m. it happened again. This time I watched the entire sequence. The mark appeared gradually, starting as faint impressions that strengthened until they achieved full definition. The palm materialized first, followed by the elongated fingers, and finally the circular patterns at each extremity. The process took nearly 30 seconds, slow enough to observe, but too consistent to dismiss as imagination. But the mark appeared in a different location, on the side window rather than the main viewing wall, positioned lower than before, as if the hand's owner had crouched or moved to a different angle. The orientation suggested someone approaching from below, reaching upward to touch the glass. I moved to the side window, studying the mark from inches away. The level of detail remained disturbing. Those circular patterns showed intricate structure, concentric rings with radiating lines that resembled biological suction cups. But suction cups belonged to cephalopods, not humans. The contradiction between the obviously human hand shape and the decidedly non-human fingertip structures created a cognitive dissonance that made rational analysis difficult. Again, I placed my palm against the glass, attempting to match the mark's position. The angle felt awkward, requiring me to crouch slightly and stretch my arm above shoulder height. If someone outside had made this print, they would have needed to approach from below the suite's level, swimming upward to reach the window. But the suite was positioned 40 meters down, well below the depth limits for recreational diving and far deeper than any maintenance operations would require. As before, the mark began fading after several minutes of observation. The retreat followed the same pattern, suction cup patterns disappearing first, then finger outlines, finally the palm itself dissolving into unmarked acrylic. The process suggested withdrawal rather than evaporation, as if whatever had made the impression was pulling away from the glass. I remained at the side window, face pressed close to the acrylic, searching the darkness for any sign of movement. The absolute void revealed nothing, but I began to notice something else. A wrongness in my own reflection. In the window's surface, illuminated by the suite's lighting, my image appeared normal from most angles. But when I shifted position slightly, when the light struck the acrylic at specific angles, my reflection seemed to lag behind my movements by fractions of a second. The effect was subtle enough to blame on fatigue or the complex optics of curved acrylic under artificial lighting, but it persisted, becoming more noticeable as I tested it deliberately. I would move my hand, and my reflection would follow a split second later. I would turn my head, and the reflected motion would lag perceptibly behind the actual movement. More disturbing was the growing sensation that my reflection was not quite accurate. The proportions seemed slightly wrong, limbs a fraction longer than they should be, fingers more elongated than normal. When I held up my hand to compare it directly with the reflected image, the differences became more apparent. My reflection's fingers stretched beyond my actual fingertips, and at their ends, barely visible in the complex interplay of light and acrylic, something that looked remarkably like those circular suction cup patterns. I backed away from the window, heart rate spiking as the implications crashed over me. My reflection remained at the glass for several seconds longer than physically possible, watching me with eyes that seemed too large, too knowing. Then it snapped back into normal synchronization, appearing perfectly ordinary once again. The coffee maker had finished its cycle, filling the suite with familiar aromas that provided welcome normality. I prepared another cup, forcing my hands to remain steady despite the tremor that threatened to make them useless for fine motor control. The taste remained normal, the temperature perfect. Nothing about the suite itself had changed, only my perception of it and of myself within it. By 5 a.m., I had convinced myself that fatigue and pressure effects were combining to create increasingly elaborate hallucinations. The human brain, evolved for surface conditions, often malfunctioned at depth. Nitrogen narcosis could occur even with proper gas mixtures if individual physiology varied from standard parameters. The resort's medical staff could run tests, adjust my air supply, prescribe medication to counteract pressure-related psychological effects. But the handprints had been real, too detailed, too consistent, too specific to dismiss as neural misfiring. And if they were real, their implications demanded consideration regardless of psychological comfort. At 5:47 a.m., the third mark appeared, this time on the rear window, the one facing away from the main current. I'd been watching the side windows, expecting repetition of the previous pattern. The mark appeared without warning in my peripheral vision, larger than the others, positioned higher on the glass, oriented as if someone had pressed both hands against the acrylic simultaneously. But when I turned to look directly, only one handprint remained visible. The other faded as I watched, dissolving with the same gradual retreat I'd observed before. The remaining mark showed the familiar characteristics: elongated proportions, suction cup patterns at the fingertips, but something about its positioning suggested desperate urgency rather than casual contact. I approached cautiously, noting how the mark was placed at the very top of the window, nearly at the ceiling line. To reach that position from outside would require significant height, either a very tall individual or someone floating well above the suite's level. The implication that something was descending from the darkness above to touch the windows made my throat constrict. As I studied the mark, movement caught my eye in the glass itself. Not my reflection this time, but something deeper in the acrylic structure. The engineered material was designed to be optically perfect, but at certain angles, subtle variations in density created internal patterns that shifted with viewing angle. What I saw now moved independently of my position, flowing through the acrylic like liquid suspended in crystal. The movement resembled a hand, elongated fingers with those familiar circular tips, pressing not against the glass from outside but through it, emerging from within the acrylic itself. The impression lasted only seconds before dissolving, leaving me staring at perfectly clear material that showed no internal structure or movement. I backed away from the window, no longer able to maintain rational explanations for what I was experiencing. The marks, the reflections, the movement within the glass itself. Each incident could be explained individually through fatigue, pressure effects, or optical illusions. But their cumulative weight and increasing frequency suggested a pattern too complex for simple hallucination. The suite's communication panel offered direct access to resort security. A single button would summon assistance, guards who could verify my observations, medical staff who could assess my psychological state, managers who could relocate me to a different room. But what would I tell them? That handprints were appearing on my windows, that my reflection was behaving strangely, that I was seeing movements within solid acrylic. They would conclude that I was experiencing pressure psychosis, a recognized condition that affected some individuals at depth, despite proper atmospheric controls. Treatment involved immediate return to surface pressure and psychological evaluation. My filming permit would be revoked, my equipment confiscated, my reputation permanently damaged. But if the marks were real, if something was outside in that absolute darkness, then returning to surface pressure wouldn't solve anything. It would only delay whatever was happening, leave it unresolved, and waiting for my return. I remained in the suite, watching the windows with growing paranoia as dawn approached. The external lighting system was scheduled to resume operation at 6 a.m., flooding the area around the resort with artificial illumination that would reveal whatever existed in the surrounding water. If something was out there, the lights would expose it. If nothing was there, I would have confirmation that my experiences were products of exhausted imagination. At 5:55 a.m., all three windows displayed handprints simultaneously, not gradually appearing as before, but manifesting instantly with full definition and detail. The marks were larger than any previous impressions, positioned as if massive hands had pressed against the acrylic with considerable force. The suction cup patterns at the fingertips showed internal structure, radiating lines and concentric circles that pulsed with subtle rhythm. I stood in the center of the suite, surrounded by evidence that something was outside in the darkness, something with proportions that suggested human origin, but details that indicated otherwise. The marks remained constant, showing no signs of fading as the previous impressions had. Instead, they seemed to grow more defined, as if whatever was making them was pressing harder against the glass. At exactly 6 a.m., the external floodlights activated. Brilliant illumination flooded the water around the suite, revealing the familiar underwater landscape in crisp detail. Coral formations stretched in all directions. Fish schools moved through the current. The ocean floor extended beyond the light's reach into natural blue darkness. Everything appeared normal, exactly as it had looked before the maintenance window. The handprints vanished instantly, not fading, but simply ceasing to exist the moment illumination returned. The acrylic showed no marks, no impressions, no evidence that anything had ever touched its surfaces from outside. But in the newly illuminated water, suspended just beyond the range of the floodlights, shapes moved with deliberate purpose. Too distant to resolve clearly, too large to be fish, they maintained position in the darkness beyond artificial lighting. As I watched, they began to withdraw, descending into depths where even the resort's powerful illumination couldn't penetrate. The shapes moved with undulating grace that suggested familiarity with their environment. Their proportions were difficult to determine at such distance, but something about their motion patterns seemed disturbingly familiar. as if I had been observing them for hours through their contact with my windows. I remained at the main viewing wall, watching those shapes retreat into the abyss, wondering whether I had been the observer or the observed during the long hours of darkness. The handprints were gone, leaving no physical evidence of their existence. The shapes in the distance might have been large fish, debris, or optical effects created by the interaction of artificial lighting with natural currents. But deep in the ocean's embrace, 40 meters below the surface, I began to understand that some questions didn't require answers. Some experiences demanded acceptance rather than explanation, and some encounters left marks that wouldn't fade, regardless of whether they could be seen. The upgrade to the panoramic suite had been a courtesy, they said. But courtesies implied reciprocity, and I was beginning to suspect that I wasn't the only one who had received something unexpected from this exchange. In the growing daylight, with normal illumination restored and the underwater world returning to familiar patterns, I made coffee and planned my dive. The thermal vents awaited, promising footage of bioluminescent creatures that gathered in the darkness. But first, I would visit the resort's front desk and inquire about the maintenance schedule for the coming weeks. After all, it would be unfortunate to miss the next opportunity for such close observation. The handprints might be gone, but something in my reflection suggested they would return. And next time, I intended to be ready for whatever was waiting in the darkness beyond the glass, whether it was outside looking in or inside looking out. In the end, the distinction might prove less important than I'd originally assumed.